Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became the Black Swordsman Part 2. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see Part 3, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story Draskir from AO3. So let's start the video. 1 down. The villain crowed, crouching down over Katsuki's paralyzed form. She could barely make out another dagger in his hands, poised and ready to strike. Barely able to look up, Katsuki noticed the hood villain fish a high-pressure syringe out of his coat. Katsuki could only feel dread, unable to move as the syringe came down, the villain laughing hysterically all the while. "Help me, Izuku," Katsuki yelled as she bolted upright in bed. Breathing heavily, she looked around her room. The sun was still up, and looked like it would be for a couple more hours yet. A quick glance at her alarm clock told her that her nap had only lasted a half hour. Katsuki groaned, sinking her head into her hands and trying desperately to block out the images of her nightmare. It hadn't been very long after she'd gotten home from the USJ incident that she'd tried to sleep off the fatigue from Recovery Girl's quirk. She hadn't even bothered to change out of her hero costume. Swinging her legs over the side of her bed, Katsuki subconsciously ran a finger over the hole made by that hooded villain's poisoned dagger and the scar on her body that would remain as a permanent reminder. A black boot came down in front of her, and Katsuki shook her head fiercely, trying and failing to block out the image of Izuku standing over her protectively. She had no idea why that had left so much of an impact on her. Granted, it only happened a few hours before, but still, she'd been driven by the idea that she had to be on top, by herself, without any help from anyone, a total victory. But Katsuki had nearly been killed in her first encounter with her first real villain. Not only that, she'd been hit with a paralysis poison, and left immobile on the ground. She'd been completely unable to fight back, and could do nothing but lay there and wait for whatever fate had in store. And fucking Izuku had come to her rescue, again. More than that, he looked angrier than Katsuki had ever seen him before, an anger that he directed at her assailant. And somehow, to Katsuki's complete bewilderment, she didn't mind it one bit. She wasn't pissed off that she had to be saved, by Izuku of all people, and that confused the hell out of her. Katsuki ran through the scenario again in her mind, beat for beat, but forced shitty hair into Izuku's place. And then she tried it again with Pikachu, then half and half, and so on. No matter who she envisioned in Izuku's place, Katsuki always got the same stomach turn that she had grown to expect whenever she needed help. But when she let it play out naturally, with Izuku, that pit in her stomach never came. Why is it only him? You don't need a quirk to be dangerous, Bakugo-san. The memory came to her unbidden for what seemed like the 1000th time lately. But Katsuki wasn't thinking about the words this time. It was the glare, the look in his eyes when he said it. She'd seen that look many times since then, but the first time had been the most striking. It was the first hint that Izuku wasn't who she remembered. The Deku she remembered had never had fire in his eyes like that. It can't be. No way. Katsuki's eyes widened as understanding began to set in. She'd always assumed that there was just something about Izuku that bothered her, that kept her thinking about his words and determination and the fire in his eyes. How the fuck did I effing knock on her door broke that train of thought and dispelled it completely. The sight of Bakugo-Masaru poking his head in with a concerned frown made Katsuki completely forget where her thoughts were headed. "Are you okay?" her old man asked. "We heard you yell from downstairs, but it didn't sound like your usual angry yelling." Katsuki just stared back with her mouth agape, watching her father shift uncomfortably in her doorway. After a moment, she let out a sigh. "Yeah, I'm good," Katsuki said, for once not putting up her usual bluster. "Just can't get my mind to shut up, that's all." "Well, all right," Masaru said as he began to back away. "Just let us know if you need anything, okay?" For an instant, an image flashed in Katsuki's mind of something she'd been desperately needing. Ever since in a flash, she was on her feet, holding her door open to prevent her father from shutting it entirely. Actually, Katsuki began slowly, heart pounding in her chest as she debated whether this was the right thing to do. There was one thing. Distantly, Katsuki wondered what the hell she'd been thinking. "Come in, please, make yourselves at home." Midoriya and Co welcomed the Bakugo family with open arms, as she tended to. In spite of Katsuki and Izuku growing distant, their parents remained as close as ever. "Oh, Katsuki-chan, I heard about what happened. I know it must have been terrible, hey, Auntie," Katsuki said as the older woman fretted over her. The Midoriya matriarch was every bit the worrywart that Katsuki remembered. "You look very nice, by the way," Inko commented. Katsuki rolled her eyes as she stepped past Inko. She'd changed into something she thought looked okay, just a simple t-shirt and skirt. She looked around as the adults conversed in the hallway. Izuku's bedroom light was off, and there were no signs of him being anywhere else in the apartment. "I'm afraid Izuku's out at the moment, but he should be back any time now, 𝗕𝗁 said, as if reading Katsuki's mind. What do you mean, out? Katsuki asked in disbelief, a sentiment that her parents seemed to share. After what happened at the USJ, my son can take care of himself, 𝗕𝗁 said confidently. I worry, of course, but I know he knows how to handle things. Besides, he's only running a friend to the station. That seemed to appease her parents, but Katsuki couldn't help but groan internally. Probably that chestnut girl again. Something inside her gut twisted again, like it did every time she saw those two together. Katsuki shook her head to clear away the thoughts, ignoring 𝗕𝗁's look of confusion as she wandered into the living room and dropped into a reclining chair. The ashen blonde girl let her mind wander as she stared at her phone, barely aware of the adults making their way into the kitchen to discuss dinner. Katsuki couldn't help but feel nervous, being here in the Midoriya home. After everything that had happened between her and Izuku, Katsuki couldn't help but feel like she was intruding, especially when the front door opened, and the subject of Katsuki's thoughts called down the hallway. I'm home, Izuku said before making a confused noise. Do we have company? Oh, Izuku. 𝗕𝗁 stepped into the hallway to talk with her son. Moments later, Izuku appeared in the doorway, shooting Katsuki a look of bewilderment. Katsuki shot to her feet, staring back at the boy like a deer caught in headlights. She watched as Izuku's face morphed through a series of emotions that she couldn't understand. Hey, Izuku, Katsuki tried, prompting surprise from the boy in question. Belatedly, she realized she was staring, and dropped back into her seat. Izuku shot a questioning look at the hag, who returned it with a smug grin. He rolled his eyes and appeared to put it out of his mind, wandering into the kitchen to investigate the dinner process. Katsuki let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Part of her had been dreading Izuku's reaction to her appearing in his home, but he seemed content to tolerate it, at least. Katsuki watched Izuku out of the corner of her eye as he conversed with the older Bakugos. I feel like it's been forever since we last saw you, Izuku, the hag said, hugging the boy tightly, prompting an awkward chuckle from him. You've definitely grown some, Masaru commented, thumping a fist on Izuku's shoulder. The boy smiled back at the older couple. Katsuki couldn't tell what was going on in his mind, but she could tell he was enjoying this much, at least. The next hour or so dragged on at a snail's pace for Katsuki. Part of her was content to sit out of the way, only taking part in the conversation when she was prompted, but another part of her was beginning to doubt the merit of everything about tonight so far. Seeing Izuku in the aftermath of the day's incident, walking around and smiling like nothing happened, was a stark reminder of his past in 𝗬𝗏. It seemed to Katsuki that today was just another day in a long line of days in which Izuku had to fight for his life. With her old way of thinking, Katsuki supposed that she should have been angry at that, finding out that the one who was supposed to just be a pebble on the side of her road had long since become one of the mountains in the distance. And yet, a sharp poke to her forehead brought Katsuki out of her thoughts, and she looked up to see Izuku standing in front of her with a soft expression. Food's almost ready, Izuku said, offering Katsuki a hand. Help me set the table. Katsuki just stared at the proffered hand for a moment, before taking it and being pulled to her feet. Izuku smiled at her before turning and heading back to the dining area. And something inside Katsuki's chest settled for the first time since the school year began. Something the matter, Izuku? 𝗕𝗁 asked with a concerned frown. Some time after the meal had started, the green-haired boy had gone quiet, apparently thinking about something. Not really. I just remembered something I used to think about. Izuku trailed off, shooting Katsuki a short, somewhat guilty look. Well, come on then, share with us, Mitsuki encouraged, elbowing her husband as she shot her daughter another smug look. Katsuki just rolled her eyes in response, but she had a bad feeling about that look. The hag only ever looked smug about things she knew she could tease Katsuki or Masaru about. Worse still, Katsuki had a feeling she knew what it could be this time around. And the way the hag was giving that same look to Izuku as well was telling. Why'd you go with Katsuki as a name? Izuku asked, prompting immediate laughter from Mitsuki and a somewhat exasperated look from Masaru. Katsuki herself just glared daggers at the boy, and was met with an apologetic smile. I know it's unisex, but it's mostly been a boy's name in history, right? I'll kill you, Katsuki hissed, her eyes narrowed at the offending bastard. I will fucking murder you. This just prompted heavier laughter from Mitsuki, to the point that she could barely stay in her chair. Izuku gave Katsuki another apologetic smile, but the girl could see at this time there was something more hidden underneath, the tiniest hint of an expression, almost as if to say, let's see you try. Mitsuki used to love telling this story, Masaru said, attempting to redirect the conversation away from the potentially violent outcome, just in time for Mitsuki herself to get her laughter under control. It's because our doctor was hungover, the hag busted out, before the laughter began again, and Mitsuki actually did fall out of her chair this time. Masaru just sighed and shared a commiserating look with 𝗕𝗁 over the blonde woman's actions. I have no idea why this is so funny to her, Masaru sighed as he rubbed his temples. To answer your question, Izuku-kun, the doctor had a migraine the day our ultrasound was scheduled. He misinterpreted what he saw and believed we were going to have a boy. We'd settled on the name very early on, so even when Katsuki was born as a girl, we couldn't bring ourselves to think of anything else. Awa, come on, Masaru-kun. Mitsuki moaned from the floor, having gotten over her fit of laughter. Why you gotta spoil my fun? I haven't been able to tell that story in years. Masaru just rolled his eyes and helped his wife up into her seat. Katsuki looked at Izuku and, seeing the amused look on his face, decided it was worth it for him to ask that stupid fucking question, even if she did kinda want to kill him over it. The rest of the meal passed by with a relatively light mood, and Katsuki couldn't help but marvel at the normalness of it all. It was a strange way to end out a day that she'd had to fight for her life in a situation she wasn't truly prepared for. In spite of her earlier doubts, Katsuki was content that she'd made the right choice, asking to come see the Midoriyas like this. Another hour went by, and the families were gathered in the living room to watch movies. Katsuki wasn't paying much attention to what was going on, and didn't even know what they were really watching. All of her focus was on the green-haired boy beside her on the two-seat couch. A black boot came down in front of her, and Katsuki was barely able to restrain a groan, squeezing her eyes shut as she tried to repress the memory. Except, it was a lot harder now, because the subject of those thoughts was right fucking next to her. A soft bump on her shoulder distracted her from her thoughts for the 100th time that day. Chancing a look at Izuku, Katsuki saw a concerned frown on the boy's face. Katsuki held his gaze for a moment, and full understanding finally set in for her as she stared into his eyes. She felt her face heat up, and so she looked away. Izuku went back to watching the movie. No one else in the room had noticed the exchange. A few minutes passed by as she contemplated her revelation. Another moment later, Katsuki leaned over and rested her head on Izuku's shoulder, closing her eyes and wondering when the hell she fell in love with the idiot beside her. And when that idiot put his arm around her, she couldn't bring herself to care anymore. In the aftermath of the USJ incident, UA closed its doors temporarily to allow for a total police investigation. There are many questions as to how the villains may have gained access to the USJ to begin with, and how they would have had information as to what teachers were meant to appear there. Coincidentally, the USJ incident had fallen on a Friday, so by the time UA opened up for lessons again, we'd only really missed one day of school. By the time I arrived for class, my classmates were gossiping about the news reports about the USJ incident. They fell quiet, however, when I stepped through the doorway. Everyone was giving me odd looks, except for Bakugo, who was just looking out the window. What? I asked, returning their stares with a confused look of my own. Several looks were exchanged amongst them, but before anyone could say anything, I felt the hair on my neck stand up. Good morning, children, said a familiar tired voice behind me. I turned sharply to face a mummified Aizawa-sensei, his face and arms bound completely in bandages. I had no doubt he looked just as tired as always, underneath those wrappings though. Sensei, shouldn't you still be in the hospital? I asked, raising an eyebrow at him, though part of me wondered if he could even see that. Probably, Sensei grunted as he limped past me. But time is limited, and the fight isn't over. I shook my head in exasperation and made for my seat, knocking my elbow against Bakugo's shoulder gently as I went by, with no response. There was a sense of dread hanging over the class as they contemplated Aizawa's words, and as usual, our tired teacher seemed content to let it linger as long as possible. It's almost time for this year's sports festival, and like clockwork, the sense of dread was popped. I was beginning to notice a pattern with this homeroom. Yo, that's a super normal thing, Kirishima cheered, much to the agreement of just about everyone in the class. Is that truly wise? Asked Yaoyorozu with a concerned frown. So soon after the USJ incident? It's all about showing the world how little we were truly affected by such an incident, Aizawa droned tiredly. In addition, security measures will be increased by 5 times that of previous years. Moreover, a vast majority of the crowd of spectators will be heroes as well. If the villains think they can take on what amounts to an army of heroes, they're certainly welcome to try. A tangible sense of relief spread through the class at those words. It's almost certain that all the top pros will be watching, I commented, resting my head on my hand. If we do well and prove our worth, we'll probably have lots of heroes and agencies trying to scout us out. And joining a famous agency will provide you with more experience and popularity, Aizawa confirmed. Anyone expecting to go pro will have to open their first door here at the US Sports Festival. Only 1 chance per year, for a total of 3 chances. You cannot afford to miss this event. Go into it with a plus ultra mentality. The class gave a collective confirmation, clearly hyped up by our teacher's speech. With homeroom being finished ahead of schedule, Aizawa stepped into a sleeping bag and slumped over behind the podium. Chatter broke out amongst the class, and though it was mostly related to the sports festival to start, it quickly devolved into hushed whispers. A quick look around showed me that many of my classmates were stealing glances at me, only to look quickly away when they saw me staring back at them. For a moment, I was reminded of my solo days in Aincrad, and that made it sting a bit. I was used to being looked at like this by strangers, not people I'd come to respect. Only another moment passed by, and I'd decided I'd had enough of their behavior. Did something happen when I wasn't looking? I asked everyone at the same time, watching as nearly everyone in the room flinched at my question. Seriously, you guys have been giving me some pretty weird looks all morning. A moment of silence reigned as, once again, looks were exchanged. There have been some concerns. Ieyasu began slowly, shifting nervously in her seat directly behind mine. Some of us witnessed your behavior at the USJ, and stories have been circulating. Nothing bad, I assure you. Just, there are questions. The creation quirk user trailed off nervously. Such as? I asked, arching an eyebrow at the lot of them. The way you jumped into those villains was pretty scary, dude, Kaminari commented, earning an elbow to the side from Jdźr̅. What? It's true. The punk girl just rolled her eyes before throwing in her 2 cents. And you went running off to fight more after sending us back to the entrance, Jdźr̅ said, glaring sullenly at me. What about that villain guy with the daggers? Hiroshima asked, shooting an apologetic look at Bakugo, who ignored him completely. It seemed like you knew him somehow. They were clearly enemies, though, Tsu-chan said with a ribbit. I'm more concerned about what he called you. Black Swordsman. What's that mean? My old title prompted a jolt of surprise from Mina of all people. Wait, what? The pink girl looked at me incredulously, shooting to her feet. You are the Black Swordsman. It was a little odd to see the ever-joyful Ishido with a wide-eyed, disbelieving expression. Nearly everyone in the room turned to stare at the pink girl in surprise, nearly every concern forgotten. Yeah, I responded, scratching my cheek awkwardly. Without a word, Ishido began to cross the room. Her expression was unreadable, and with every step she took, my confusion and nervousness grew. When the pink girl reached my desk, she pulled me to my feet and wrapped her arms around me in a tight hug. Thank you, she mumbled into my chest. Awkwardly, I returned the hug, shooting a look of bewilderment at my equally confused classmates. After what felt like an eternity, the pink girl backed away from me, smiling gently at me, her eyes watering up a little bit. My older sister is in 𝗬 Survivor. She was there for the final battle, and she watched you beat the final boss by yourself. That prompted yells of surprise from nearly everyone in the class, except for Bakugo, who was just staring oddly at me in the way she seemed to a lot lately. I could only stare in shock at the pink girl, my jaw hanging open. She'd never mentioned being related to another survivor before. Do you know what her username was? I asked as my brain started to catch up. I certainly couldn't claim to know everyone that was present for the final battle, but most of the people in the lead group had reputations of their own. Meet, something like that, I think. Ishido looked thoughtful as she tried to remember, though it was enough to spark my own memory. Mitra Surik, I supplied, prompting a wide smile from the pink girl. Yeah, that's it. I guess you knew her? Huh. Not personally, I said, causing the pink girl to deflate just a bit. Mitra was a higher lieutenant in the top guild, the Knights of Blood. Asuna, over in 1B, was the second in command of the COP. The class watched our exchange with mild amusement, until the sound of a throat being cleared pulled attention. That's all pretty cool, but I'm still concerned about that villain, Kirishima said, leaning back in his chair with crossed arms. I know he was your enemy and stuff, but how do you know him? And what does he have to do with that death gun thing you mentioned? That villain said something about a laughing coffin, too, Todoroki said from the back of the room, prompting looks of discomfort from many of our classmates, and confusion from the rest. Even Aizawa-sensei straightened up a little at the mention of the PK Guild. Laughing Coffin was a guild of player killers in 𝗬, I said with a grimace, and all confusion turned to horror or disgust. The villain I fought, Johnny Black, was one of their top leaders. Player killers, Ada quoted, visible concern on his face. As in, people who killed other people within the death game. That's right, I sighed, raking my hand through my hair. There are many people who didn't believe that the death game rule actually existed. Worse, some people just didn't care. A simple concept like player killing might be fine in other games, but it equates to actual murder in 𝗬, and there were those that just didn't believe it. Somehow, that's abhorrent, Ieyasu exclaimed, holding her hands over her mouth, horror clear in her eyes. As for Death Gun, I marshaled on, pushing past the air of unease that seemed to be hanging over the class. There was an incident late last year involving 2 members of Laughing Coffin, and their use of the name Death Gun as a cover. I believe I saw the news reports on this incident, Takoyami piped up. It took place within the VR game, Gun Gale Online. Correct. Yeah, I confirmed, nodding my head at the bird-like boy. Johnny Black was one of those 2 members of Laughing Coffin. I can't really go into the details, because the case is still technically ongoing, but I was the one who brought the death gun scheme to an end. How did you get involved with such a clearly dangerous case? Tokoyami asked with a single raised eyebrow. It was on a hunch, actually, I answered, scratching my cheek awkwardly. I was scouted for it by Detective 𝗧𝗂𝗁𝗍𝗂. He was the one to do my interview after 𝗬𝗏 ended, so he was aware of my history with VR games and such. The hero of Aincrad goes around solving mysteries after the end of 𝗬𝗏, Ashido joked, punching me in the shoulder lightly. You could be a comic book character, hero of Aincrad. Is that what they're calling me now? I asked, raising an eyebrow at the pink girl, who just grinned back smugly. It seems irresponsible to bring in a minor for such a dangerous case, 𝗧𝗧𝗏 commented, looking conflicted. Though, if you are the one who cleared 𝗬𝗏, perhaps there may have been merit. It was a last resort for a case that had no leads. Everyone jumped when Aizawa-sensei spoke up. I gave the sleepy man a surprised stare, and was met by his ever-deadpan look. Don't look so surprised, Midoriya. Every underground hero worth their salt kept up with the 𝗬𝗏 case as it happened. And I work with 𝗧𝗂𝗁𝗍 on a regular basis. So, what? You knew about the death gun case while it was going on. I was the one who recommended you for the case to begin with. I stared incredulously at the tired man. Not only did he know who I was, but he was the one who made the choice to involve me in the death gun case. What the hell? Sit back down, children. Homeroom will be over soon. Ashido and I returned to our seats, and all conversation ended for the time being. I could barely comprehend what my teacher had just told me, but I could only assume it was the same for what I had just got done telling my classmates as well. It occurs to me, Midoriya-kun, that I don't know your motivation for becoming a hero, 𝗧𝗏 commented as we stepped out of the classroom for lunch. I assume it has to do with 𝗬𝗏. It does, but it wasn't always that way, I responded, clasping my hands behind my head as we walked down the hall. When I was little, I just wanted to be like All Might, saving people with a smile and inspiring people. And then 𝗬𝗏 happened, Jiryu commented, twirling one of her jacks around a finger. Yeah, I sighed, letting my arms drop as our group came to a halt. I couldn't begin to count how many people I've seen die. Some of them were people I knew, people I cared about. All they wanted was to go home, to be with the friends and family they could barely remember, because of the death game. Well, that's why you're here, right? 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏 asked, resting a hand against my arm gently, to honor their memory, and prevent it from happening again. A statement rather than a question. And a correct one at that. I gave her a determined smile, but stopped short when she looked aside guiltily. Is something wrong, 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏-san? I asked gently, watching with concern as the usually upbeat girl grew more nervous. Oh, it's nothing, she sighed, shifting from one foot to the other. Just, your reason for being a hero is more heroic than mine. That's all. What is it? I'm sure it can't be all that bad. 𝗧𝗏 started, but trailed off when 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏's nervousness only grew. It's, money. I blinked at the girl in surprise as she started scratching the back of her head awkwardly. Money? Jiryu repeated blankly, apparently not seeing an issue. Put simply, yeah. But, it's more complicated than that. Even if it wasn't, I don't see a problem, 𝗧𝗏 commented, once again performing a thinking man pose. As a hero, you would be providing a service to society, and using the money from that to support your own livelihood seems a perfectly justified reward. What he said, Jiryu commented, pointing one of her jacks at 𝗧𝗏, and I nodded along in agreement. Well, what's your reason, then? 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏 asked, puffing her cheeks out, clearly unused to her goal being accepted in any capacity. 𝗧𝗏's first response, however, was to smile. I come from a family of heroes, the bespectacled boy began, puffing his chest out with pride. Are you familiar with the turbo hero, Ingenium? Isn't he a really popular hero in Tokyo? I asked, tapping my finger against my chin. Last I heard, he had 65 sidekicks at his agency. That's correct, 𝗧𝗏 exclaimed, grinning widely and placing his hands on his hips. And most relevantly, he is my older brother. Tensei is a well-respected hero who honors the rules and helps all those he can. I want to be a hero so I can be like him. Hey, that's pretty cool, Jiryu said, elbowing the bespectacled boy gently, causing him to somehow grin even wider. That grin grows any more, and he'll split his face apart. What about you, Jiryu-san? 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏 asked, swapping her attention to the punk-themed girl. Sorry, but it's really nothing special, Jiryu commented, twirling her jack around a finger once again. I was inspired by heroes when I was a kid, so I want to inspire people as a hero myself. The punk girl shrugged her shoulders at 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏, who seemed to deflate somewhat. I think you're fighting a losing battle, I said, elbowing the usually cheerful girl gently. You don't always need a grand or epic reason to do something. Being a hero itself is worthy of respect, because you're helping others. Isn't that enough? I guess. 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏 didn't seem convinced at first, but after a moment of consideration, smiled brightly back at me. You're right, maybe I'm just overthinking it. We continued on our way after that, chattering about mundane things on our way to the cafeteria. I had an itch in the back of my mind though. With the sports festival on the horizon, I couldn't help thinking that things were about to get interesting. Moments after 𝗧𝗫𝗍𝗪, Jiryu and I finished our conversation in the hallway, we'd been hailed down by All Might, leaning around a corner and asking me to come have lunch with him. 𝗧𝗫𝗍𝗪 had found it amusing, comparing the hero to a schoolgirl, but my friends had ultimately waved me off. As soon as we'd arrived in the teacher's lounge, All Might dropped his muscle form and got to the point of the conversation. Less than an hour? That's not good, I said, performing a thinking man's pose. Indeed, All Might agreed as he poured tea into a pair of cups, handing me the first as soon as it was full. The length of time in which I can use my power has steadily decreased in the last year, and my fight with that 𝗕𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗵𝗍 exacerbated it to an unhelpful extreme. I gritted my teeth, staring down into my cup of tea. Part of me wanted to blame myself, but I knew objectively that it wouldn't help. Well, these things happen, All Might said with a sigh, trying to appear optimistic, but not really succeeding. At any rate, there was another matter I wanted to discuss. You haven't done much with One for All yet, have you? No, I haven't, I responded, swirling tea around in the cup. I'm still not really even sure what to make of it, honestly. It feels similar to my own quirk on a conceptual level, but I haven't figured out how to use it without doing both by accident. Though, there was one moment. Something different happened. Yeah, at the USJ, I explained, taking a sip of my tea and setting it down. When Johnny was about to use the drug on Bakugo, I got really angry. I'm not really sure why, but I subconsciously used One for All to close the distance and save her. All Might rubbed his chin in contemplation. Perhaps One for All responded to your desire to save your classmate and provided a boost for you. Maybe. It was the first time I really tried to use my powers to save someone. Could be worth remembering, at least. That's the spirit, young Midoriya. All Might laughed heartily, flashing a thumbs up at me. Any form of progress is good, especially now. I'm glad. My mentor and I shared a determined smile. When the moment passed, I reached for my tea, and All Might stood up to look out the window. My time as the symbol of peace is running out. I gripped my cup of tea tightly as those words left All Might's mouth. It was an inevitable fact that he wouldn't be able to keep up with heroics for much longer. A moment of silence passed, and my teacher turned to face me once more. I chose you as my successor. Your feelings on that haven't changed, have they? Of course not, I answered, setting my cup aside for the 100th time and standing up to face All Might. Then the time has come for you to show it, All Might stated, his eyes boring into me. My eyes widened, and despite him being in his skeletal form, I could feel the full weight of his presence as the symbol of peace. The entire country will be watching the sports festival, and I want you to face them and declare yourself. Tell the world, I am here. I could only stare at the hero in awe, until a moment passed and a thought struck me. Is that really a good idea? I asked, causing All Might's powerful presence to deflate somewhat. Declaring my presence as the successor of All Might himself, while I'm still a first year, might be more detrimental than anything else, you know. I feel like it'll put an unnecessary target on my back way too soon. You may be right, young man, All Might said, dropping back into his seat on the couch with a sigh. It's just, I fear for society. Once I am no longer the symbol that will deter the villains from encroaching, many of those villains are already beginning to realize. The USJ incident is proof of that. Declaring myself as the new symbol won't mean much until I graduate, I commented. To be honest, I had a thought about that. Me, being the symbol of peace. What thought would that be? All Might asked, looking at me curiously. Well, honestly, I don't think I can do it. Not alone. I looked away from All Might guiltily as I considered my explanation. Before you say anything, I'm not trying to back down from my duty. I just think a change is necessary if this model is going to keep working. A change? Of what sort? Put simply, it's a miracle that you were able to be the pillar that you are for as long as you have. I honestly think that going it alone will only make me repeat what you've been through, and if something happens before I find my own successor. I trailed off for a moment. I don't want to risk that happening. So my idea is this: don't make me the next symbol of peace. Instead, let me and my classmates use your work as a foundation to stabilize the future. So I shouldn't entrust this to you alone, but to all those who would share that wish. Let the symbol of peace pass, and allow it to give rise to the foundation of peace instead. All Might looked thoughtful, before a grin slowly formed its way over his skeletal face. Well, this is interesting. Once lunch came to an end, I returned to class, my exchange with All Might weighing heavily in my mind. Afternoon classes did little to assuage my anxiety for the coming festival. All too soon, though, classes came to an end, and Class 1A was let go for the afternoon. Or we would have been, if not for the wall of students blocking our way out. What the heck? 𝗧𝗫𝗍𝗪 exclaimed, shifting from one foot to the other as she looked out over the sea of faces. Do you have business with our class? Ida asked. I took a spot beside him, feeling equal parts amused and confused. Probably scouting us out for intel. 4 eyes, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 muttered as she walked by, eyeing up the crowd to look for a way out. We're the class that survived a villain attack. After all, with the sports festival coming up, they probably think they can get away with checking us out. Fucking pointless, if you ask me. The ashen blonde girl came to a halt, squaring up with the unmoving crowd and glaring at them with fierce eyes. Move it. Various students in the crowd exchanged looks of unease, and I couldn't help but shake my head at 𝗵𝗃𝗁's demeanor. She was a lot more calm recently, but no one outside our class had been around her long enough to know that. Before I could say anything to try and defuse the situation, an unfamiliar voice piped up from the middle of the crowd. We came to see the legendary Class 1A, said a boy with wild purple hair and tired eyes. You seem pretty arrogant, though. I narrowed my eyes at the boy, who stared back unfazed. Are all the hero students like this? He continued, rubbing the back of his neck. Makes me kinda jaded about the heroics program. Honestly, a lot of students were forced to pick one of the other courses just because they didn't qualify for the hero course, and now I'm wondering if we got the better deal. The purple-haired boy was cut off by another student reaching up and pulling roughly on his ear, prompting an amusing yelp of surprise. That isn't very nice, 𝗫𝗁𝗁, a familiar-looking girl with brown hair and black-rimmed glasses, spoke up as she tugged on the boy's ear. I couldn't help but smile at the girl, and was met with an equally bemused smile of her own. Yo, Sinan, I greeted the girl, who responded with a casual wave. Asada-san, you know this guy? Shinso asked, swatting Sinan's hand away from his ear as he stared between her and myself. Oi, oi, another new voice shouted before anyone else could say anything. Everyone in the vicinity turned to look at the newcomer, a student with silver hair and a comically furious expression on his face. I'm from Class B next door, shouted the silver-haired boy. I wanted to hear about your encounter with the villains. Don't start getting too full of yourselves. You don't want to come across like your bark is worse than your bite. The silver-haired boy was cut off by Asuna appearing seemingly out of nowhere and swatting him across the back of his head. That's enough, Tetsu-Tetsu-kun, Asuna said sternly, fixing the boy with her second-in-command glare. You don't get to say they're being full of themselves when they almost got killed by actual villains. Once the silver-haired boy was sufficiently cowed, Asuna moved her glare to the rest of the crowd, and most prominently to Shinso. He stared back unfazed for a moment, before looking away with a somewhat guilty expression. The second Asuna's gaze landed on Sinan, however, it melted into a happy smile. Hi Sinanen, Asuna exclaimed warmly, pulling the brown-haired girl into a hug, which was happily returned. I couldn't help but smile at the two, but nearly everyone else just seemed confused. I feel like the point of all this got kinda lost somewhere. 𝗎𝗎𝗎𝗀 chuckled, scratching her cheek awkwardly. I just flashed her a quick grin, which she returned before walking off to chat with Asuna, who introduced her to Sinan. Most of the crowd began to disperse after that, seeming equal parts amused and confused by the turn of events. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 shot me a raised eyebrow before she disappeared into the crowd herself. That did not go how I wanted it to, Shinso muttered, shooting an annoyed glare at the back of Sinan's head. Sorry about them, I offered, shooting the purple-haired boy an apologetic smile, only for him to swap his annoyed glare to me instead. Don't think you can start cozying up to me just because you're friends with her, Shinso snapped. I couldn't make it into heroics, but with the sports festival, you might see fit to promote me up. Of course, that means one of you would have to be demoted in turn. Shinso-kun, Sinan said, her tone low in warning. Shinso glanced at the brown-haired girl, sighed in aggravation and walked off. Friend of yours? I asked, raising an eyebrow at Sinan as my classmates started filing out of the classroom around us. Kinda, yeah, she responded, clasping her hands together behind her back. He's pretty bitter about having to do general education. Something about his quirk not being suitable for fighting robots. Neither is yours, though, I pointed out with a wry grin, prompting a withering look from the brown-haired girl. Good for me, then, since I'm not trying to be a hero, Sinan said with a huff. Right, I laughed, holding my hands up placatingly when the brown-haired girl looked like she was ready to start growling at me. You're looking to be a detective, right? Not a bad route at all. Sinan just rolled her eyes and turned back to Asuna. Always the cold shoulder with this one. Oh, by the way, Asuna, my mom's been working on that recipe you shared with her. Over the 2 weeks that followed, classes dragged on at a snail's pace. I kept up with my personal training routine nearly every day, trying to keep thoughts of the coming festival out of my mind. Of course, that almost never worked out. It reminded me too much of the wait before a boss raid in Aincrad. It really didn't help when I remembered that the entire event would be shown on TV. Before I knew it, those 2 weeks were up, and the day of the sports festival arrived. Try to be careful, Izuku, Mom admonished, fretting over me as I got ready for the day. I'm going to the Dicey Cafe to watch. Agile-sen said he'd recorded in high definition. All right, say hi to those guys for me, okay? Right, do your best, Izuku. Mom and I shared a determined smile. before I turned and headed out the door to face whatever awaited. It was a little odd, the way people recognized me in the streets and on the train. Ignoring those hushed whispers and corner-of-eye glances was nothing new to me, given my history as in 𝗬𝗏, but there was something different about it this time. I tuned it out for the most part, but I could tell that a majority of it was sympathy or respect over the USJ incident. Like I said, odd. I had a sense of déjà vu as I approached UAS campus and saw a crowd of reporters hovering outside the front gate. Some of them were taking opportunities to interview staff and students, but the majority of them were just complaining to one another about how long the bag checking was taking. Just as before, I slipped through unnoticed. Despite showing up in my school uniform, there are no actual classes to attend today. The sports festival, traditionally, was the main event to kick off Japan's Golden Week, during which there would be no classes at all. With that in mind, I headed straight for the locker rooms and changed immediately into my gym uniform, and moved on to the waiting area for participants in the sports festival. Man, I wanted to wear my costume. Ashido complained as soon as I entered 1A's waiting room. We have to keep things fair for the other courses, placated Anjiro, his tail swaying gently behind him as he did warm-up stretches. Chatter continued on like that as I breezed past most of my classmates, dropping into a chair next to Jiryu. Are you ready for this? I asked the punk girl, leaning over to keep my voice low. I have no clue, honestly, Jiryu grunted, twirling a jack around her finger nervously. I keep wondering what we'll have to face in the first round. It's always different every year, right? Can't be worse than anything we've faced up till now, I remarked with a crooked grin, only to be met with a stony glare. What you've faced, you mean? Jiryu stated evenly as she crossed her arms, and I could only cringe. I know you know how to handle yourself, more than anyone else in our class, but it still stings, dude. It won't happen again, I said, prompting a surprised look from the punk girl. I curled my fists in my lap and gave Jiryu a look of resolve. A beat of silence passed by, and Jiryu returned my look with one of her own. It had better not, Midoriya. From across the room, Katsuki couldn't tell what Izuku and ears were talking about. It looked kinda serious. But it didn't stop her gut from twisting itself into knots just from seeing those two together. And it was so much worse now that Katsuki knew why. She could only groan as her head hit the table. Now was not the time to be worrying about shit like this. Thankfully, something tapped on her shoulder, and she eagerly took the chance to distract herself. Yo, Bakugo, you good? Shitty Hair asked, pulling a chair up and sitting next to her. Kill me now. I'm ready, Katsuki grunted in response, pushing herself back up and trying not to stare at the pair across the room. That bad, huh? The red-haired boy chuckled, shooting the ashen blonde girl a wry smile before adopting a semi-serious expression. I'm kinda wondering something, if you don't mind me asking. Did you and Midoriya grow up together? Katsuki turned and regarded Shitty Hair for a moment, before grunting in confirmation. He looked like he had more to say, but he wouldn't get the chance, as their attention was drawn by half and half speaking up. Midoriya, Todoroki said, approaching the green-haired boy with a single hand in his pocket. What's up, Todoroki-san? Midoriya returned, standing up to face half and half properly. A moment of silence passed by, and Katsuki could feel tension begin to build between the two. Everyone in the room was watching them now. It's a close call, but I think I'm stronger than you, half and half said stoically, prompting a chorus of surprised noises from the rest of the class. Izuku's first response was to narrow his eyes at the heterochromatic boy in front of him. And Izuku's stance shifted, and for a moment, Katsuki was reminded of the pressure he gave off back at the battle trial. You've earned All Might's favor, haven't you? Todoroki narrowed his eyes, shifting slightly where he stood. I won't pry, but I'm going to beat you. That prompted another chorus of surprised noises, and Shitty Hair rose from his seat to try and de-escalate the situation. Hey, come on now. No need to pick a fight so soon. We haven't even started the events yet. All we're going to be doing is fighting each other. Todoroki cut in, glaring at Kirishima. I'm not here to play at being friends or anything, either. Todoroki. Any chatter was cut off before it could begin, and half turned to look over his shoulder at the green-haired boy that had called him out. I don't know why you're singling me out here, Izuku began. Maybe you are better than me. I know you're one of the most capable people in our class. Looking at it objectively, I'd say we're an even match. Todoroki turned and faced Izuku fully. Everyone will be trying for the top with everything they've got. And I as well. Izuku gritted his teeth, looking very frustrated for a moment. I'm here, and I'm going to give it my all. Because I can. And that means the tension drained out of Izuku. And he leveled a fierce glare at Todoroki, whose eyes widened in surprise. That means I don't have the right not to. Izuku and Todoroki stared each other down with determined glares. But the moment passed by quickly when President Mike came over the intercom and summoned the students to the field. It's time for the first years to come out. Todoroki turned and left the room without another word, and the rest of the class just watched him go until Izuku stepped out of the room after him. Several looks were exchanged, and after a moment's hesitation, the class filed out after them. Arriving at the end of the tunnel and stepping out into the field, Katsuki could only squint at the sudden change of brightness. With a lurch in her chest, the ashen blonde girl could only stare in awe at just how many people there were in the stadium, gathered to watch the sports festival in person. And now, the class that overcame an enemy assault with nothing but their own determination, it's Class 1A. Gah, it's worse than when I fought Heathcliff that one time, Izuku muttered, quailing somewhat at the number of spectators present. Mike continued announcing the other classes and courses as they came through, starting with 1B and moving through Gen Ed, support, and business courses. Many of the kids from Gen Ed were shooting dirty looks at classes 1A and B, and at Katsuki in particular. The ashen blonde girl just sneered back, barely restraining herself from showing them all the bird. Ahead, the R-rated hero, Midnight, stood upon a small stage at the center of the field, posing dramatically. "It's time to hear the players' pledge," Midnight announced, cracking her whip once all students had gathered before her. Representing the students this year is the one who scored the most points in the entrance exam, Midoriya Izuku, class rep of 1A. Izuku looked like a deer caught in headlights when his name was called, and for a moment, Katsuki wondered if he'd try to back down. Surprisingly, the green-haired boy quickly swallowed his surprise and stepped forward. Katsuki could see his shoulders trembling very slightly as he ascended the steps and took his place in front of the microphone. A moment of silence passed as Izuku considered his words. "I pledge," Izuku began, his voice shaking somewhat from his nerves. "I pledge that I, and every other person here, will tackle today's events with every ounce of our strength. The sports festival is a time-honored tradition, and we will all act in a manner which reflects that, this I swear." A little wordier than Katsuki would have preferred, but it drove the point home in any case. It was enough for the crowd to erupt in applause and cheering. And even the kids from other courses looked kinda fired up to boot. With a deep breath to recenter himself, Izuku turned and stepped down from the stage, taking a spot between Katsuki and Jiryu. "Now then, let's get this party started, shall we?" Midnight exclaimed, cracking her whip once more. On every screen in the stadium, the list of possible events started rolling, as if to randomize which one would be first. Katsuki had no doubt it was just for show, and that the entire event had been planned already. "Let's see what the qualifying first game shall be." As if on cue, the lists halted their rolling and showed what the first round of the sports festival would be. Obstacle course race. Midnight launched into her explanation of the rules, but Katsuki tuned her out with a feral grin, cracking tiny explosions in her palms. "Let's fucking do this. An obstacle course race, eh?" I watched as Midnight listed off the rules and scenario for the first event of the sports festival. The length of the course would be the entire outer circumference of the stadium, almost 4 kilometers, and we were free to do and act however we wanted as long as we stayed on the course, something I'm sure Bakugo would be rather pleased about. "Now then, everyone to the start." Midnight cracked her whip, and the crowd of students made their way to the indicated start gate. At the top, 3 green lights came on with a distinct sound. From my place in the crowd, I couldn't see much of the tunnel in front of me, but it was obviously very narrow. Just navigating the tunnel alone would be very cramped, and my quirks wouldn't have much of an influence on that. I'll have to get as far ahead as I can from the start. The first light at the top of the gate blinked out. I did a couple of quick stretches and took a deep breath, quieting my mind as best as I could. The second light blinked out. I settled myself into combat mode, ready to sprint as soon as time was called. The third light blinked out, and there was a pause before the race began. In that pause, a familiar presence appeared at my side. I glanced sidelong at Asuna, and we shared a determined smile. Start. Chaos ensued as every student in the crowd piled into the tunnel all at once. Voices all around me were crying out, complaining at the tight space. I couldn't help but shake my head in exasperation. No matter how much I agreed with them, progress was slow, and I could feel various people digging into my sides, however unintentional. "Midoku-kun," Asuna called from somewhere behind me. I could tell by the tone of her voice that she had something planned, so I simply halted, letting students pass me by as I waited for my best friend to reach me. Many of those students gave me odd looks as they went by, but I could only smile back smugly. If it's what I think it is, we'll be out of here in no time. A single moment passed by as I waited, and then I felt Asuna's hand grab a hold of my shirt. In the next moment, the world around us flashed bright yellow, and all the students around us were 4 meters below us. Rather, we'd appeared about 4 meters over their heads. "Get ready," Asuna shouted. I did as she commanded, and flooded my arms full of electricity. Without wasting any extra time, the world flashed bright yellow a second time, and we went from the halfway point of the tunnel to being mere meters from the end. In the instant that we jumped, Asuna let go of me, and in so doing preserved my forward momentum. I shot out of the tunnel like a rocket, just in time for a massive blast of cold air to erupt behind and around me. Yuuki Asuna, quirk, flash warp. She can transport herself and anything she's in contact with at lightning speed. for a distance of up to 10 meters. Letting go during the warp preserves forward momentum, but she cannot do that with her own body. Using my static thrusters to land safely, I paused just long enough to assess the situation behind me. Todoroki emerged from the cloud of cold dust that had been kicked up, freezing the ground as he ran along. Behind him, the vast majority of the students had been frozen to the ground, unable to move. Despite Todoroki's effort, I could see the majority of my classmates in 1A bypassing the ice with relative ease. I turned and ran, wanting to keep the lead that Asuna had provided for me. I didn't make it very far, however, as there were a number of familiar-looking robots blocking the path. Now, time to put the obstacle in this obstacle course. First barrier, Robo-Inferno. Todoroki didn't pause, didn't even bother slowing down as he primed his glacial attack. His ice exploded forward, enveloping the entire group of robots as they were primed to attack, and kicking up a massive cloud of dust and mist. My bastard of a father is watching, so I can't let up, Todoroki said to himself, and I shot a look at him as he disappeared into the cloud. I shook my head roughly and followed him in, trying to be mindful of the frozen debris falling around me. It's like the entrance exam all over again. Behind me, I could hear my classmates squabbling with each other as they overcame the obstacle ahead of them. And it wasn't long before the sounds of other robots being destroyed reached my ears. Many students have pulled ahead, and it seems like nearly all of them are from Class A. President Mike yelled over the intercom. Class A knows not to stand around, came the tired voice of Aizawa-sensei as more and more of the robots were destroyed by my classmates. Because of the USJ incident, they've experienced firsthand the world they're training to enter. They've tasted the fear and the resolve that's born from it. With that resolve, they've drowned out their hesitation. More and more, the sounds of destruction reached my ears, and I cast a glance over my shoulder to see what my classmates were up to. Of course, I couldn't see much. Bakugo's explosions took up much of the view, but I could see the telltale signs of other damage. Some robots looked like they'd been ripped apart, or fried by other forms of energy. And is that a cannon? Yaoyorozu made a cannon. So, the first barrier wasn't that much. Let's see what the second one's all about. President Mike screamed, drawing my attention back to the course ahead of me. I skidded to a halt at the edge of a cliff, and audibly gulped as I looked out over a chasm that was littered with stone pillars. Connecting the pillars were ropes, just shiny enough to make me hope they'd be able to conduct my electricity. It's the fall. Many of my classmates began to catch up by then, and Tsu-chan didn't hesitate to leap out and start crawling down one of the ropes. As expected of her frog quirk, I supposed. The sound of ominous giggling drew my attention back to the crowd behind me. Ah, it's finally time, cheered a pink-haired girl with goggles and other devices strapped to various parts of her body. Many of the students around her, including myself, could only stare at her bizarre demeanor, and I faintly got the impression of a mad scientist. I finally get to show off my babies. Our babies, May, came the voice of a familiar, equally device-ridden girl as she swatted the other girl over the shoulder. No need to sweat the details, Liz, May shouted, grinning maniacally as she surveyed the chasm ahead of her. Wire arrows and hover souls will be more than enough for this, I think. Without waiting another moment, the manic girl blasted into the chasm with what appeared to be engine shoes, much to Lisbeth's chagrin. Wait, May, Liz called, but gave up when the pink-haired girl went beyond earshot, crossing her arms and pouting. Why does she never listen? Hey, how come you guys get to use support items and stuff? Uraraka asked as she caught up, pulling Liz's attention away from her friend. It's because we don't get any of the combat training you hero students get, Liz commented, shooting me a quick, smug grin. It's all about fairness. We can use whatever we want, as long as we made it ourselves. At that moment, Asuna showed up in a flash of light, shooting a quick smile at Liz. In a move that mimicked her friend May, Liz took a running jump and used her own pair of hover shoes to blast off into the course. I'll see you around, Midoku. Midoriya-kun, did you know her in Sao? Uraraka asked, raising her eyebrow at me cutely as I face-palmed. Good to know she's starting to pick up on that. She was my blacksmith, I confirmed, chuckling lightly at the girl's confused face. Without bothering to explain, I turned and jumped onto one of the wires connecting the cliff to the chasm. I channeled my electricity into my legs and pushed it down through my feet, and much to my relief, I was able to flow freely along the wire with my electric grind. With a quick launch, I pushed myself away from the wire and glided over to the next one with my static thrusters, grinning to myself all the while. Moving forward in that fashion, I was able to reclaim my spot in second place. Up ahead, I could see Todoroki finish crossing the chasm, and I could hear the explosive sounds of Bakugo overhead as she vied against me for second place. And now we've arrived at the final barrier. Most excitingly, it's a minefield. I could see Todoroki up ahead, playing it slowly and stepping between the mines without blowing any up. As I stopped to try and come up with a plan, Bakugo blasted past me overhead, breezing by the minefield with her explosions. Not long after that, other students ran past me, some of whom made the mistake of trying to go too quickly and paying the explosive price. As Bakugo caught up to Todoroki, the two started squabbling again, and Todoroki was forced to lay down enough ice to keep himself moving forward at a reasonable pace. They're already past the halfway point. More and more students rushed past me into the minefield, and if I didn't act quickly, I'd lose out on the top spot. I couldn't reasonably expect Asuna to give me another boost like she had before, especially after the number of times she'd probably used her quirk. I could see her up ahead, making reasonable progress through the field, but she wasn't using her quirk anymore. I shook my head roughly and forced myself to focus. I needed a boost to catch all the way back up again. A boost. And there's all these mines here. I called upon one for all to extend the range of my electrokinesis. With a quick pulse, I could determine exactly where each mine was under the ground. If I was gentle enough, I could pull them up into the air without setting them off. Once I had 10 of them free and floating around me, I bunched them up behind me and leapt onto a single mine that was still buried. Using the force of that mine to launch myself up, I positioned my cluster of mines at just the right angle so that I could land on them and use the resulting force to propel myself forward along with my static thrusters to keep myself stable. Whoa, what's that huge explosion in the back? Shit, I got the angle wrong. I'd meant to use the blast to propel me clear across the entire minefield, but I could see my arc landing at around the 3/4 mark, right where Todoroki and Bakugo are about to be. Looks like Midoriya used a bunch of mines to his advantage, and is explosively closing the distance between him and the leaders. They turned and gawked at me for a moment, but recognized the danger and rushed to try and clear the final obstacle as quickly as possible. In a flash, however, I overtook them completely, leaving the two to try and catch up. "Damn it, Izuku," Bakugo screamed behind me, launching herself into the air to try and fly over the remaining mines. Meanwhile, Todoroki amped up the amount of ice he was laying down so that he could sprint to the finish. Based on where I was about to land, those two would overtake me completely if I did nothing, and I wouldn't be able to take back the lead from there. No matter what happens, I can't let go of this chance. I charged electricity throughout my entire body, building it up as I let my static thrusters drop. Without my gliding ability, I dropped like a rock, pushing electricity out to an almost painful degree. Thunder drop. Being as electrically charged as I was, the concussive force of landing forced that electricity out of me in every direction, and in this case, detonating every mine around me. I got lucky with the landing, having dropped onto the very edge of the minefield, so that the resulting explosion pushed me even further forward even as it knocked Todoroki and Bakugo backwards. Landing in a classic Parker roll, I was able to keep my momentum up as I sprinted into the tunnel toward the finish. I could hear Bakugo screaming angrily behind me, neck and neck with an equally frustrated Todoroki. Well, look at that. Midoriya just cleared the entire minefield in a single instant. As President Might and Izuku-sensei went back and forth with their commentary, the light at the end of the tunnel grew closer and closer until I stepped out to the roaring cheers and applause of the stadium. And now we have the winner of the first event, Midoriya Izuku. I slumped over, hands on my knees as I took several deep breaths. Todoroki appeared at the end of the tunnel, with Bakugo hot on his heels, swearing a string of curses all the while. Seconds later, a worn-out Asuna showed up, panting heavily as she came to a stop next to me. "Man, I think I overdid it a little," Asuna exclaimed, slumping over to match my posture, and I grinned back at her tiredly. Bakugo glared at us for a moment as she struggled to catch her own breath, to which I just rolled my eyes. Students trickled in slowly at first, but once the top 50 or so arrived, they started showing up in larger volume. Historically, it had been the top 42 winners of the first event to move on to the second, and most of the rest just tended to give up and meander their way to the finish. Gives me a few extra minutes to rest, at least. Midoriya-kun, that was amazing. 𝗬𝗓𝗏 cheered as she approached Asuna and I, her hands curled up in fists and held close against her chest. What even was that? I just saw a huge blast. And then you were flying through the air. My electricity could have set off mines by proximity if I wasn't careful, I explained, scratching my cheek awkwardly. So, I did the next best thing, and used a bunch of them to my advantage. I had to close the gap somehow. The gap that you created by stopping to stare at the minefield, Asuna quipped, poking me in the cheek lightly. Seriously, you were in second place before then, why'd you just stop and gawk like that? You did the same thing at the second obstacle too, 𝗬𝗓𝗏 commented, and I shot her a withering look as Asuna narrowed her eyes at me. I had to be careful, I protested, swatting Asuna's finger away from my face as 𝗬𝗓𝗏 started giggling. Besides, I got first place in the end, so maybe it pays to stop and analyze once in a while. Maybe. But you got first place by being about as reckless as you always are, Asuna said, crossing her arms with a little huff. One of these days, you'll pull a stunt like that and not be able to stumble your way out of it. Yeah, I mumbled, slouching a bit as I let Asuna have the last word. This was one of our most long-standing arguments, dating back to our time in 𝗬𝗏. Asuna had never been very pleased by my solo tendencies, and the risks usually born from them. One yeah is enough, mister, Asuna chided as she poked at my cheek again, prompting me to swat her hand away again with a little growl. After an extra few minutes to allow the last stragglers to catch up, Midnight rallied the mass of students back to the center of the arena. Now then, Midnight began as the leaderboard came online on the screen behind her. The top 42 competitors will advance to the next round. I scanned the board, barely listening to Midnight as she outlined an event that would be held for those that didn't make the top 42. All of Class 1A got in, as well as 2 from Gen Ed, and 2 from Support. Looks like my class only missed 1 person for the second round, Asuna commented, as if she were reading my mind. The real battle starts from here, Midnight announced, cracking her whip to draw our attention back in as the board started rolling the list of events once more. Give it your best shot. I already know what the next game is, but what could it be? Just as before, the board came to a halt just after the R-rated hero finished talking, and highlighted the event for the second round. Cavalry battle. Surprised murmurs and chatter spread around the students that made it to the second round, and I could only grit my teeth. Of course it would be a team-based event. I wonder if it can get any worse. Midnight launched into the rules once more, explaining that we could form teams of 2 to 4 people and that one person would be the rider. If the rider fell to the ground, our team would be disqualified, and our points lost. However, if our points were stolen, we would still be in the fight, with a chance to claim someone else's points. So, the same as a regular cavalry battle. The way points are distributed is a little different, Midnight commented, posing dramatically as the leaderboard appeared behind her once more. It's all based on your placement in the first round. Last place gets 5 points, the next person up gets 10, and so on. So every person contributes to the team's total points, 𝗬𝗧𝗏 said as understanding dawned on her. Every team will be worth a different amount of points, in that case. That's right, Midnight confirmed, cracking her whip with a mildly irritated expression on her face. My eyes were glued to the top of the leaderboard, at my first place rank, and the number of points associated with it. I had to fucking jinx it, didn't I? And the winner of the first round, naturally, has the most points, 10 million points, to be exact. Son of a bitch. Every person around me turned and stared. I could feel the hunger in their eyes. And the feeling was only exacerbated with Midnight's next statement. It's survival of the fittest, with a chance for those at the bottom to overthrow the top. Midnight continued on with additional rules, covering the idea of the headbands and where they were allowed to be worn. I could barely pay attention. And before I knew it, the presentation was over with 15 minutes for us to build our teams. I took a single cursory glance around, and everywhere my eyes landed, people shied away or shifted attention elsewhere. There were plenty of people crowding around Bakugo and Todoroki, all vying for the attention of those near the top. After a couple minutes, I began to worry that I'd be disqualified for being unable to find a team. That is, until a hand swatted at my shoulder from behind me, and I turned to face Asuna and 𝗬𝗧𝗏. Hey, what are you spacing out for? Asuna asked, shooting me a concerned frown. We should probably come up with a strategy if we're gonna survive this event, right? You sure you want to team up with me? I asked, prompting a bewildered look from my best friend. Everyone will be fighting for the 10 million. You know, it might be better if you guys pick a safer team. This, coming from the strongest person I know. Asuna sighed and rubbed her temples. Midoku-kun, I don't really care about winning or losing. I do want to give the best account of my abilities that I can. And there's no better way for me to do that than at the side of the one person I really feel comfortable teaming up with. Besides, it's best to team up with people you get along with, right? 𝗬𝗧𝗏 chirped, smiling brightly at Asuna, and I do want to win, and you're one of the strongest in our class. Heck, you're probably the strongest first-year period. Mr. Hero of Aincrad. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. This girl is just too cheerful. A moment passed by, and I couldn't help but grin broadly back at the pair of girls in front of me. Having Asuna beside me in a fight felt like old times, even if we were both without the swords we were accustomed to using. In addition, 𝗬𝗧𝗏's quirk and general combat ability were nothing to scoff at, so I was confident that she'd make a great party member. We just need one more person then, I said, indirectly accepting Asuna and 𝗬𝗧𝗏 as my teammates for the second event. The three of us slouched a bit, entering classing thinking poses as we tried to think of a good fourth. As if directed by fate, that person came to us, tapping me on the shoulder to grab my attention. Yo, said Sinan, smiling brightly at us with a casual wave. Got room for one more. I stared back at her, and a wide grin slowly spread over my face. Perfect. So, how are we going to do this? Asuna asked. She'd accepted Sinan as our fourth immediately, and that was enough for 𝗬𝗧𝗏 to agree as well. I'll be in front, I answered. Asuna, Uraraka, your quirks will work regardless of where you're placed. From the front, I can defend the front and both sides at the same time. Wouldn't you be better off as the rider? Uraraka asked, raising an eyebrow at me. You'd be able to defend every side at once. Sinon is the best fit for the rider, I said, prompting a look of confusion from the bubbly girl. It's because I don't have any ranged attacks, Sinon explained. My quirk is good for evasion and CQC. CQC? Uraraka quoted, looking even more confused. Close quarters combat, I supplied, shooting a look at Sinon, who rolled her eyes. So you'll be the DPS, Uraraka-chan, and I will be the support, and Sinon will be tank, I think, Asuna summarized, before trailing off confusedly. Tank's probably not the best term for it, Asuna, I commented with a chuckle. She'll be drawing all of the aggro, which is exactly what a tank is supposed to do, Asuna argued, narrowing her eyes at me. Tanks do it on purpose, I pointed out. Technically, it's our team as a whole that will be doing that. Also, tanks are supposed to take hits, which is the opposite of what we want Sinon to be doing. Uraraka shot a confused stare at Sinon, who hid her face in her hands with an exasperated sigh. I'm lost, Uraraka declared, puffing her cheeks out as she pouted at Asuna and I don't know any of those terms. Asuna had the grace to look sheepish, and started explaining the terms to Uraraka, who had apparently never played a video game before. I shot the bubbly girl an apologetic smile, then shifted my attention to Sinon. We've got some pretty tough customers, I commented, drawing the bespectacled girl's attention. Will you be able to keep using your quirk like that? If it's just for short bursts, I should be fine, Sinon answered, seeming somewhat wary of the idea. Not looking forward to the headache I'll get from it, though. If we play our cards right, you should only need it once or twice. Recovery girl's quirk works on headaches, so she'll take care of you when it's over, too. Sinon still looked a little worried, but any response she may have had was cut off by a loud buzzing sound. All right, looks like it's time to get started. The four of us exchanged quick looks, then quickly assembled our horse. As we had planned, I took my spot at the front. Asuna flanked me on my right side, Uraraka on my left, and Sinon took her place atop their interlocking arms. They've had 15 minutes to form teams and strategize, and now we have 11 cavalry teams on the field. Present Mike screamed over the intercom, stoking the cheers of the audience. Looks like some interesting combinations down there. Aizawa-sensei commented tiredly, probably having just woken up from a quick nap. Present Mike continued with his commentary, building up hype as the teams assembled in a large circle. Sinon fiddled with the headbands that she had been provided. On her head was her own 70 points, with the other 3 hanging from her neck. The 10 million headband was carefully layered behind both of the other ones, so that it would be harder to reach. I took a look around at some of the other teams, noting Todoroki and Bakugo's party compositions, and that they had both claimed the rider spot for themselves. Now, let's get ready for the countdown. 3. Bakugo let off a small explosion, startling Ashido, who was the right wing of their team. Kirishima, their front, appeared to say something to Bakugo, who responded by swatting the red-haired teen's head. Zero rolled his eyes from the left wing, and shared a look with Ashido. 2. Todoroki shot a challenging look at me. The front of his horse, Ada, settled into a running stance. In the rear, Kaminari and Ieyasu put on determined faces as they balanced on what appeared to be roller blades. 1. I took a deep breath and flooded electricity into my arms. Uraraka used her quirk on herself, Asuna, and Sinon, leaving me as the sole anchor. Start. With a chorus of battle cries, nearly every team in the stadium rushed us for a chance at the 10 million. We didn't move right away, though. I watched as the enemy teams grew closer and closer, and waited for the right time to call our first maneuver. And just when the time seemed right, Asuna, I called, and the world flashed bright yellow once again. Just like the tunnel from the first round, we appeared above the heads of the other teams. Only difference was, we jumped the full distance that Asuna was capable of going, roughly 10 meters. Below us, I could see the ground distorting in an odd way, as if it had been softened into liquid. Given that the rest of my team was weightless, I was able to easily glide beyond the crowd of enemy teams, and guide us down for a safe landing at the far end of the arena. Behind us came the indignant cries of our competitors, some already chasing after us, others fighting amongst each other. Our strategy had 2 layers. First, we would use Asuna and Uraraka to escape to the air for as long as the 2 could still use their quirks, only 2 more times now. Second, we would fall back on Sinon to evade attacks with her quirk, which she could do between 3 and 6 times depending on how strongly she applied it. After that, I would be our last line of defense, backing us into a corner so I could defend with my electrokinesis. Of course, our 2 main competitors wouldn't make it easy for us. I could already see the Bakugo and Todoroki teams closing in on us. On the far side of the field, I could see headbands being passed around, taken by force or stealth as the number of teams with points began to dwindle at a rapid pace. Incoming, right side. Asuna called, and I snapped my head over to see the large 𝗬𝗁𝗔𝗂𝘁𝗵𝗆 circling around to approach from our right. His arms were held up and spread out, so that his webbing created a protective dome over his riders, whoever they might be. So, what was that about a tank? Uraraka asked with a little chuckle, only to let out a small eep, as Takoyami's dark shadow burst from an opening between Xiaoji's arms. I reacted quickly, discharging electricity with both arms in parallel, pushing outward to create a shock wave that repelled dark shadow backwards. Clever, Midoriya, Takoyami commented, peering out of the darkness at me, before backing away to make room for Tsu-chan's tongue to shoot out like a bullet. We were able to dodge with a quick redirection, but the frog girl's tongue still bounced off the side of Sinan's head, causing the brunette to shudder in mild disgust. A moment passed by as Tsu-chan's tongue retracted, and then she and Takoyami started to attack in earnest, both of them using their quirks to attack rapidly with increasing accuracy. At the same time, a line of tape produced by Zero crossed my line of vision. "We need to move," I called, prompting Uraraka to drop the gravity from all but myself. Once they were all weightless, Asuna took us directly up in a flash. We weren't completely out of range of the enemy attacks, but they'd have a harder time aiming accurately with the new distance. Unfortunately, an explosion from the ground told me that as much as we'd bought some time, we hadn't bought nearly enough for our strategy to hold up without flaw. Izuku, Bakugo rocketed into view, flying up above our current position with her explosions and ignoring the angry yelling of her team. Using an explosion to redirect and planting a boot in my face to stabilize herself, Bakugo reached out to take the headbands secured to Sinan's neck. In spite of the ashen blonde's sudden appearance taking us all off guard, Sinan was prepared. "Double," Sinan shouted, and leaned back away from Bakugo's grip faster than anyone should have been able to move. Bakugo spluttered in surprise, doubly so when I took a hold of her leg and threw her off, allowing Asuna a chance to jump us away to safety. Pada Shino, quirk, accelerate. She can speed up her perception and, to her, it seems as though the world around her is slowing down. She can also speed up her body movements to match, allowing her to move around at higher speeds. The stronger the effect, however, the higher the toll it takes on her mind and body. I threw Bakugo a quick, smug grin as she fell back towards her team and was pulled back into position by Zero's tape. Just as she was prepared to make a second attempt on us, her team was intercepted by a team from Class B that was led by a boy with short blonde hair. "I can't use my quirk anymore," Asuna commented as we made to land. "I've used it too many times, and I think Uraraka-chan's about to be out of gas as well." There was an audible groan as gravity was returned to my teammates, and it seemed Asuna's assessment was correct. "All right then, time for Phase 2, I said, flooding my arms with electricity. "Sinan, how are you holding up?" "I can keep going for a bit," Sinan answered, rubbing her temples lightly. "I only did double acceleration one time, so I can use my quirk a couple more times if need be." "All right, I'll keep them off as much as possible, so only use it if you feel you need to." Sinan gave a hum of confirmation just as Present Mike's ever-boisterous voice came over the intercom. "The cavalry battle has just entered the second half. Shit, only halfway done." Just when the time had me anxious enough, Todoroki's team came to a halt before us, with the heterochromatic boy shooting me a challenging glare. A moment of silence passed, and he swapped his glare to Sinan, eyeing up the headbands around her neck. "I'll be taking that, now." Katsuki could only see red. She supposed it was only natural for her team to be angry at her for flying off to fight alone, but it still pissed her off. That was nothing, though, compared to the sneak attack that was pulled off by a team from Class B. Worse still, all of her headbands were stolen, leaving Katsuki's team with nothing. "You Class A kids are too predictable," the blonde-haired rider said, smirking back in the face of Katsuki's anger. "Where'd he come from?" Ashido shouted, staring at the boy in shock. "I don't give a fuck where he came from, but he better give those damn headbands back." Katsuki let off a few small explosions to vent, only to be further enraged by the opposing team's nonchalance. "The first game was just a qualifier, right?" the boy asked as he tied the headbands into place. "Historically, it's always been between 40 and 50 people who make it past the first round, so we have Class B hung back in that range." For observation, Katsuki started growling as the blonde boy smarmed his way through his explanation, twirling the last headband around his finger before tying it into place. "While you Class A types ran ahead to show off, we decided to play smart and learn about your patterns." "So, what, you did this as a class?" Katsuki spat, watching as several other Class B teams approached from various sides. "For the most part," the boy answered. "Not everyone was for it, though. Our class rep certainly didn't seem interested. But that's her choice, I guess." Katsuki tried for a moment to wonder who the boy could be talking about, but pushed it out of her mind, refusing to let it be a distraction from the fight at hand. "Real fucking interesting," Katsuki said, rolling one of her shoulders. "I couldn't care less, though." "Ah, of course not." However, the boy pondered for a moment, before sending Katsuki a dark grin. "I bet you do care about fame, though." And I know you've already got a bit, too, as the victim of the sludge incident. Katsuki narrowed her eyes dangerously at the Class B boy in front of her. One of his teammates reprimanded him for goading the ashen blonde girl, and she was dying to prove that guy right. Katsuki could feel the rage building up inside her with every word that came from the mouth of the bastard in front of her. You should tell me about it, sometime. How it feels to be attacked by villains on a yearly basis. Oh, you're fucking dead. Kirishima, Katsuki ground out, her voice tight with rage. All three of her teammates looked at her with concern, waiting for her to speak. Change of plans. Before we get the 10 million, we're gonna fucking kill this guy. It was a little odd how calm Katsuki felt in spite of how angry she knew she was. She didn't take any time to try and reflect on it, though. There was only one thing on her mind, and that was to deal with the bastard that knew nothing of what he was talking about, especially when that bastard could do nothing but smirk arrogantly back at her. Bakugo, chill, Kirishima called, turning to try and plead with his rider. We'll never get our points back if you don't cool it, bro. If he had anything more to say. He was cut off by an explosion that Katsuki let off as she slammed her fists together. I'm completely fucking calm, Katsuki declared, grinning fairly at the enemy team in front of her. Let's get in there and take back our goddamn points. Kirishima didn't seem too convinced, but set himself forward regardless. Without wasting any time, the Baka squad ran forward at full speed, with Katsuki herself primed and ready for assault. As the ashen blonde launched a medium explosion forward, however, she was surprised as the blonde rider dodged to the side rather easily. Coming to a halt on the far side, Katsuki turned to face the blonde boy, and earned an explosion to the face, an explosion that she didn't set off. Oh, that's really nice, the blonde boy murmured, grinning smugly at Katsuki's surprised face as he swatted Kirishima's hair. Why would he bother with such a weak little attack? Katsuki narrowed her eyes at the blonde boy in front of her, and decided to test an on-the-fly theory. With a loud curse as a front, the ashen blonde girl let off a sizable explosion in her enemy's face, and growled audibly when the smoke cleared to reveal that her theory was correct. I fucking knew it, Katsuki growled as she stared the blonde boy down, noting that half his face and both arms were hardened. This guy's a copycat. That's right, the boy crowed, letting the hardening fade away slowly. I can use each one for 5 minutes, but only one at a time. Can't all be perfect, I guess. Before either side could make another move, a torrent of gray sludge poured in between the two teams, which resulted in Kirishima being unable to move one of his legs. Monoma, we need to go. We're in second place now, no point in antagonizing them. The blonde boy, Monoma, smirked at Katsuki one last time, then turned to leave. Ashido began spraying acid from her foot, attempting to free the red-haired boy from his bindings, Zero trying to rush her all the while. Oi, flat face, Zero perked up, staring at Katsuki with a mildly offended expression. I'm going ahead. Pull me back when I'm close to falling, got it? Katsuki waited only a moment for the black-haired boy to understand, but didn't wait for a response as she blasted off of her team. Ahead of her, Monoma slouched down slightly, grumbling something about persistence as he turned to face her once more. Of course, that didn't last long, as he saw how close Katsuki was to landing on top of their team. Tsuburaba, guard. The brown-haired boy in front blew hard, projecting a mostly transparent sheet of what felt like glass for Katsuki to land on. Without wasting any time on pondering, the ashen blonde girl slammed her fist down twice on the floating surface, before breaking through the top part with an explosion. With a feral shout, Katsuki reached through and grabbed just over half of Monoma's headbands from around his neck, and leaped backwards away before the enemy could retaliate. Just as Katsuki instructed, Zero pulled the ashen blonde girl back into position with her team. Monoma didn't waste any more time with gloating, and directed his team away to safety. Back in third place, Katsuki spat, glaring daggers at Monoma's team as they retreated. We can make it to the next round with just this, Kirishima shouted. There's only a minute left, so if we fuck that, Katsuki screamed, slamming her fist down on Kirishima's head. We're finishing these guys off, then going for the 10 million. Katsuki's teammates just stared in wonder, and before they knew it, the angry girl's passion had spread to them. Without a word of protest, they set off, chasing down Monoma's team. At Katsuki's command, Zero launched his tape forward, creating a line forward for the team to follow. An instant later, Ashido began laying down a stream of weak acid for the team to slide on, and Katsuki pointed her palms backward. As the pieces fell into place, Katsuki launched her team forward with explosive force, and grinned evilly as she enjoyed the look of dread that appeared on Monoma's face. Before anyone realized what happened, Katsuki's team had blasted straight past their target, leaving the enemy with 0 points. No time to waste, Katsuki yelled, directing her team towards a wall of ice some ways down the field, and leaving the stumped Monoma team behind without a second thought. We're getting in there and taking the 10 million from Izuku. Izuku, huh? Ashido teased, prompting a round of snickering from her male teammates. Shut your fuck, raccoon eyes. I guess we're doing this now. And not later, huh? I said, a bead of sweat dripping down my brow. Across from me, Todoroki stared at me with a moderately angry glare. He seems kinda upset with you, Midoku-kun, Asuna commented from my right, sounding somewhat concerned. Did you do something to make him angry? I don't know what his beef is with me, I responded. It could just be about the 10 million thing, you know. Regardless, we've still got half the clock to burn through, and we're almost at the last phase of our strategy. Be ready for anything. My teammates all gave their confirmations as Todoroki's team closed in for their first assault. 𝗧𝗪𝙢𝗧𝗔 produced both a rod and a large blanket. And given my experience at the USJ, I knew exactly what was about to happen. I called for the team to back away quickly as Todoroki pulled the blanket over himself, Ida and 𝗧𝗪𝙢𝗧𝗔. Without wasting any extra time, Kaminari unleashed the full scope of his electricity, blasting out in every direction to subdue every team in the vicinity. I latched onto the wave that came our way and pulled as hard as I could, absorbing as much as possible so as to spare my teammates from being fried, but the rest of the teams couldn't be saved. Midoriya-kun, jump. Uraraka commanded, having pulled gravity from our entire team, including me this time as well. I gritted my teeth, but did as she commanded. Just in time, too, because Todoroki sent out a wave of ice binding every other team in the area to the ground. Well, Todoroki froze all those teams to the ground in an instant. Present Mike screamed over the intercom. He waited until after Kaminari shocked all of them. Aizawa-sensei responded tiredly. He probably took into account the number of people that avoided it at the start of the first round. As soon as the ice passed by, Uraraka dropped her quirk, and we fell back to the ground. Are you okay, Uraraka-san? I called. It had already been established that she couldn't use her quirk anymore, and that was before the attack just now. I'm fine, Uraraka responded sickly, sounding very much not fine. Sinon reached down and rubbed Uraraka's back for a moment, helping the bubbly girl get over her queasiness a bit faster. Todoroki's team advanced ever closer, taking headbands from frozen teams as he passed them by. They all shouted and cursed, calling him cheap, but were ultimately defenseless to his attack. Sorry, but I might as well take these, Todoroki said dryly, waving the headbands for emphasis before strapping them to his neck. Out of frustration, I sent a quick megawatt hammer at them, only for it to be blocked by a thin wall that 𝗧𝗪𝙢𝗧𝗔 created. And then we jerked to a stop, and with a quick look over my shoulder, I saw that we'd been back straight to the edge of the playing field. The wave of ice that Todoroki sent before had sprung up into walls that boxed us into a rather cramped area as well. Things are starting to look grim. Through some kind of miracle, or repeated miracles, we managed to keep away from Todoroki's assault over the next few minutes. With every failed attempt, I could see Todoroki grow more agitated, a sentiment that was slowly being shared by his teammates as well. There's only one more minute left, Ida commented, drawing the attention of his teammates as he settled into a prepared stance. I can create a small window for you, but you have to time it very carefully. Make sure you get the right one, Todoroki-kun. Todoroki and his team stared at Ida with perplexed expressions as the bespectacled boy's leg engines fired up. A second passed by, and the flames emitted by Ida's engines turned white-hot as he pushed himself to an extreme level. Torque over, Ida blasted forward, moving faster than any of us had ever seen him go before. Reciprocal burst. They were upon us in an instant, fast enough that I couldn't react besides a single shout. Sinon, I warned sharply, but I was too late. She was already moving. Triple. Sinon bent backwards at triple speed, twisting away from Todoroki's grip and nearly falling over. With a quick movement to let her adjust, I moved us away from the enemy team's path, but not before Todoroki claimed 2 of the headbands from Sinon's neck. Moments later, they'd circled back to where they started, with Ida's 3 teammates looking very much shaken up over what he'd just done. Ida, what Todoroki started, but cut himself off as he examined the headbands he'd claimed. Shit, I looked over my shoulder at Sinon. And though she was clearly feeling the effects of a triple acceleration, she grinned broadly at me as she showed off the 10 million still on her neck. All right, Sinanen, Asuna cheered, smiling happily up at the brown-haired girl. I grinned broadly back at her for a moment before focusing my attention forward at the team in front of us. Todoroki himself seemed incredibly dismayed that he hadn't been able to get the right headband. With the way things looked on the leaderboard, his team would remain in the top 4 no matter what, and they were still in second place even now. Not to worry, Todoroki-kun. We'll continue trying for as long as there's time. Ida charged forward, forcefully pulling Todoroki out of whatever funk he'd fallen into. Come on, we're almost there. I let my determination show as they advanced closer, flooding my arms full of electricity and priming for a series of shock waves to keep them at bay. Subconsciously, I tapped into One for All. I could feel its energy mingling with my electricity, warping my currents from blue to green. Todoroki's eyes widened, and as we entered close range, flames erupted along his left arm. In the same instant, I spread my arms out at full speed, using a shockwave to split the air between us and halt their advance. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏 stared in shock at the flames on his arm as they died out, seeming betrayed by their appearance at that moment. At that same instant, an explosion marked Bakugo's arrival on the scene as she broke down a wall of ice to give her team passage into the cramped space. She took a single look at the situation, barked something at her team, then took to the air to fly directly at us. Izuku, I backed my team away in a panic, pushing us away from 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏 and Bakugo both as they advanced to try and claim the ultimate prize. And just as Bakugo was about to land on us, time's up. The cavalry battle is now over. I let out a sigh of relief as Bakugo fell flat on her face, her team dismantling and running up to check on her as she started pounding her fist on the ground. Asuna helped Sinan to the ground as the other teams dismantled, most of which were grumbling in disappointment about not making the top 4. Now, let's see what teams will advance to the final round. In first place, it's Team Midoriya. Great job at the end there, I said, gently elbowing Sinan's shoulder before directing my attention towards Uraraka and Asuna. And we had a great start, too. Teamwork makes the dream work, Uraraka chirped, grinning broadly. In second place, Team 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏. Sorry, Ida, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏 said, looking away from the bespectacled boy guiltily. I wasted the window you created. It's okay, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏-kun, Ida said with a polite smile. We still got second place. We may yet have gotten first, however, if I had been able to continue. You are likely the reason we even got second place at all, Ida-san, Yaoyorozu placated with a gentle expression. Kaminari could be seen in the background, proudly displaying a pair of thumbs up and a very derpy expression. In third place, we have Team Bakugo. God fucking damn it, Bakugo screamed, sitting cross-legged on the ground, trying very hard to pull her hair out. Third fucking place, again. There's still a chance to take first place in the tournament, Bakubro, Kirishima said, rolling his eyes and sharing a look with his other teammates. His words did nothing to placate the angry girl at all. And in fourth place, we have Team Shinzo. When did they start getting points? Thanks for your hard work, Shinzo said calmly, smirking at the 3 very confused teammates that he left behind. Of the 3, Ajiro was the only one with an idea of what happened, but he couldn't be sure. All he really knew was that he couldn't move forward with a win like this. His pride wouldn't allow it. These 4 teams will advance to the final round, a classic tournament. A tournament, the one thing that doesn't change, year after year. My teammates and I all cheered at our victory. The hardest part was yet to come, most likely, but I couldn't help but be excited. There was a wide range of possible competitors, and I couldn't wait to find out who I'd be facing off against. Now then, let's take an hour-long break for lunch. I'm starving. I'm going to sleep. Just as I was about to join my friends for lunch, a tap on my shoulder stopped me in my tracks, and I turned to face a very stern-looking 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏. Midoriya, a word, if you don't mind. In private. This is so awkward. From where we stood at the end of an emergency exit hall, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏 stared impassively at me, looking somewhat ominous as the shadow of the building covered only half of his face. I couldn't help but fidget mildly as we stared each other down, and my already frayed nerves could only split further and further. You overpowered me. I almost flinched as the words left 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏's mouth, his eyes boring into me with an intensity rivaling that of the cavalry battle. You made me break my oath. Oath? I quoted. I hadn't missed the shocked expression on his face towards the end, when the flames had appeared. The only time they had appeared. In battle, I will never use my left side, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏 intoned. It sounded a lot like a mantra to him, one that he'd forced himself to remember at all times. He pulled his left hand from his pocket, as if to inspect it as he continued talking. None of the others felt it. At that last moment, I was the only person who truly felt your will. Meaning what? 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏's hand fell back to his side, and he went right back to staring intensely at the USJ. You were too busy fighting that villain, but I saw All Might's full power up close. I felt it, and then I felt that same pressure from you, just now. What are you getting at, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏? I asked tensely, my hands itching for a sword that wasn't there. Midoriya, are you? 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏 paused, a little unsure of himself for a moment, before pushing on. Are you All Might's secret love child or something? PFFFD. I stared back for a moment, trying to hold in my laughter, but it was too much to contain. I started laughing, so hard that I nearly keeled over, my hands clutching my sides as they began to ache. Not the reaction I anticipated, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏 commented dryly, leaning back against the wall as he waited for me to recover. Sorry, I wheezed, finally pulling myself together after what felt like forever. I just wasn't expecting that. I didn't know you had a sense of humor, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏-kun. I wasn't joking, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏 sighed wearily, and I almost cracked up a second time. I held myself together, though. Are you, or not? Not really sure why you think I am. Honestly, I chuckled, leaning against the wall across from 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏. Our quirks don't match up. Your mother's quirk, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏 started, but I cut him off. As a weak telekinesis, I finished for him with a grin. I know you heard what I said about that on the bus to the USJ. My father's quirk was the same as Kaminari's. Todoroki looked down, contemplating my words for a moment before accepting them. It doesn't really matter to me how you're connected to All Might, but I can tell that you are, and that means I have all the more reason to beat you. The last traces of my amusement fell away at that, and I stared back at the half-and-half boy across from me. What difference does it make? I asked, slipping my hands into my pocket to mirror Todoroki's stance. He just sighed and closed his eyes, chewing on his response for a moment. The number 2 hero, Endeavor, is my father, Todoroki said after a moment of silence. I nodded along. It was basically common knowledge by now, as was the next fact that came out of Todoroki's mouth. He's been stuck at number 2 forever, always trying in some way or another to take the spot from All Might. I stayed silent as Todoroki went on, waiting patiently for him to make his point. As a hero, Endeavor made a name for himself by fighting villains and winning with crushing force. But above all else, he covets the top, the number 1 spot. As such, All Might is nothing more than an eyesore for him. But he knew he couldn't win through force alone, and so he moved on to another plan. What's this about, really? I asked gently, drawing Todoroki's gaze back to me. What are you trying to tell me? Todoroki seemed to hesitate for a moment. Right then, his eyes flicked downward, and his hands curled into fists within his pockets. Do you know what quirk marriages are? Oh no. They became prominent in the first couple generations after quirks appeared, I answered solemnly. Another generation later, it became so bad a problem that it was supposed to have been outlawed. Todoroki actually snorted at that, his lips curling up in a bitter smile. Were it only so, he said lowly, his eyes clenching shut. It was an old-fashioned way of thinking, and exacerbated by a lack of ethics, something my old man took to rather easily. With his money and accomplishments, he easily won over my mother's relatives. The more he spoke, the more I could see Todoroki's misery begin to shine through. And now he wants to use me to fulfill his own desire. That's why I was created. Well, shit, I commented eloquently. It's so annoying. Todoroki continued as if I hadn't spoken. I won't become the tool of a scumbag like him. In my memories, my mother is always crying. He raised his left hand to cover the scar on his face, gripping ever so slightly. Your left side is unsightly, she said as she poured boiling water on my face. I felt something in my gut twist as he said that, and I could only stare in shock as the pain and misery shone through even more brightly than before. I'll rise to the top. To show my bastard father, he cut himself off as he reconsidered his words. I'll reject him completely by winning without his power. Todoroki and I stared each other down once more, but it felt really different now that he'd said his piece. I couldn't help but see his demeanor in a completely new light. But there was one thing that itched. That's kinda fucking stupid, I said bluntly, prompting a look of surprise and anger from the boy in front of me. Before you say anything, I'm not gonna try and deny anything you've said about your dad. Fuck Endeavor. Then what? Todoroki asked warily, seeming placated by my notion against his father. Winning without his power is stupid, for a number of reasons, I started, and Todoroki started glowering at me again. Firstly, your fire isn't his power. That's like saying that your body is his, just because it came from him originally. Is that true? No, of course not. Todoroki snapped, pushing himself away from the wall with an agitated expression. Then why isn't that true for your quirk? I pressed, narrowing my eyes at Todoroki. If your body is yours, then so is your quirk. That's not, you don't get it. Todoroki sighed heavily, turning to face the darkness of the hallway. You're right, I don't, I confirmed. After everything you've said, I don't think I want to. Besides that, do you think it matters to him how you get to the top? If he made you to be the greatest or whatever, he'll probably be happy that you made it to the top, regardless of how much or little power you actually use. You don't know what you're talking about, Todoroki growled, hunching over with curled fists. If you really want to reject him, then why even become a hero in the first place? I pressed, taking a single step towards him. If you really don't want to use your left side, why not get a job as a firefighter? You didn't have any problem icing an entire building during the battle trial, and you'd get the pleasure of putting out fires to boot. Todoroki turned and swung then, but I saw it coming and ducked under. As his fist sailed over me, I stepped up and pushed him into the wall, holding him there. I'm not gonna try and pretend like I understand what you had to go through, I hissed, glaring fiercely at Todoroki. But you cannot become a hero if you're going to literally half-ass things like this. Do you not realize what kind of damage that'll do? You're so focused on your personal problems that you don't see what kind of failure you're setting yourself up for, and everyone around you will pay the price. Shut up. Todoroki struggled against me, trying to push me off, and failing miserably. You're driven by your hatred of your father, but no matter how justified it is, all you're doing is pissing all over everyone's determination. Family problems or not, you can't become a hero if your own hatred is your only motivation. At worst, you'll be a villain disguised as a hero. And at best, you'll just be the same as your father, whether you want that or not. I yelled the last few words as I pushed away from Todoroki and the wall, breathing heavily as I tried to contain my anger, and Todoroki appeared to be in much the same state. "I want to become a hero," Todoroki said quietly, hesitantly. The words seemed to surprise him, somehow, as if he'd forgotten it during his years of abuse. I said nothing as the boy turned and walked away, heading off into the sunlight. I watched him go, then turned and headed the opposite direction. As I rounded the corner at the end, I nearly ran face first into Bakugo, who pushed off the wall to face me. "You good?" Bakugo asked bluntly, staring at me impassively. "Shit sounded pretty intense just now." "How much did you hear?" I said resignedly, slouching as I sidestepped her question. "All of it," Bakugo answered, and I buried my face in my hands with a groan. "Don't get your tits in a twist, nerd." "I won't say anything." Bakugo made to move past me, knocking her shoulder against mine as she went. I turned to watch her go, then shook my head roughly and went back the other direction. Todoroki-kun looked kinda upset about something, Uraraka commented, sipping on a glass of water. "What do you think he wanted with Midoriya-kun?" "No idea," Kyoka answered, resting her arm on the back of the couch she was sitting on. "They'd already disappeared by the time I found you guys, so you'd know more than me. Todoroki-kun told me that he'd refuse to use his flames in combat," Ida commented, holding his hand against his chin. "However, there were some flames towards the end of the battle. Perhaps he was surprised into using them, somehow, and believed Midoriya-kun to be responsible." "That doesn't make sense," Asuna said, setting her cup down with a look of confusion. "Why would he refuse to use half of his power like that? Does he really think he can win by handicapping himself?" "I don't know, Asuna-chan. He seems pretty strong with just his ice," Uraraka said with a shudder. "In terms of quirks, he's probably stronger than all of us combined." "It's not just about strength, though," Asuna argued. "He's at the most prolific hero school in all of Japan. One of the most prolific in the entire world. Half-assing it like that is just arrogant and disrespectful to everyone that's giving it their all. I believe there may be more going on behind the scenes that Todoroki-kun has not made us aware of," Ida pointed out, one of his hands making a distinctly Ida-like chopping motion. "You could say that again," came a tired voice, and Kyoka looked up to see Midoriya drop into the empty seat beside her. "There's a whole mess of crazy going on behind his scenes." Before anyone could question his words, Midoriya stretched out on the couch, laying his head directly in Kyoka's lap and passing right out. "Ew," Kyoka said intelligently, shooting her friends a look of bewilderment, only to be met with a range of amused faces. Asuna in particular had a glint in her eyes, and based on what she'd seen before, Kyoka couldn't help but be afraid of what might come next. "Looks like someone's gotten rather comfortable," Asuna teased, and despite knowing it was aimed at Midoriya, Kyoka couldn't help but blush a little bit. Asuna's expression settled into something more soft after that, though. "It's a little odd to see Midoriya-kun sleep so peacefully," Ida commented, peering over the table at the boy in question. "He spends a lot of his free time napping, if you can believe it," Asuna commented, resting her chin on her hand as she watched her friend sleep. "Probably to catch up on all the times he missed out back in Aincrad." "How could he miss out on sleeping?" Kyoka asked, resisting the urge to shift around and risk waking Midoriya by accident. "Rather easily, actually. Aincrad was set in a virtual world, and we had virtual bodies. Our real bodies were always being tended to by nurses and such, so we didn't have to worry about things like sleep or food. That seems irresponsible to ignore such basic needs," Ida commented, scowling a little bit. "I guess it's hard to understand if you weren't there," Asuna said, her eyes starting to droop a little. "We were always grinding for experience or items that let us keep up with the meta. No telling what new things we'd find on every new floor, so we did what we had to. Midoku-kun always took it a few extra steps further though, with his solo stuff. Probably why he spends so much time sleeping now." Kyoka's expression softened at that, and she could help but run a hand through his hair with a fond gaze. Across from her, Uraraka made a little noise as she apparently also went to sleep, resting her head on her arms with a cute expression. Looking around, Kyoka saw that Asuna had drifted off as well, and even Ida seemed to be dozing as well. "That's odd," Kyoka mumbled, half to herself, even as she felt her own eyelids start to grow heavy. She hadn't even felt that sleepy before Midoriya showed up, but now she felt like she was ready to pass out. As she looked back down at the boy, wondering how he could have had this effect on his friends, he shifted and mumbled something under his breath. Now facing up, his lips curled into the tiniest of smiles, and Kyoka felt something flutter in her chest. Well, shit. It was only a half hour later that the lunch period ended, with Midoriya being somewhat embarrassed at the reactions he'd elicited from his friends over his nap. He'd apologized profusely to Kyoka, who waved it off despite not being able to look the green-haired boy directly in the eye. Back in the stadium, the entire first-year student body was once again gathered to hear the next portion of the day's event. Now, I'm sure many of you were disappointed that you couldn't make it to the final game, but there's still a glimmer of hope for you to shine. For the next hour or so, we'll hold a series of low-key games that everyone can participate in. The big screens came alive with the tournament bracket, with names being randomized for each of the first matches. After seeing who all had made it to the final round, Kyoka couldn't help but feel a bit relieved that she wouldn't have to deal with it, but she still wished she'd have a bit more opportunity to shine. The last round is a tournament, right? Ashido asked, elbowing Kirishima gently in the side. Is it always like that? Kinda, but not really, Shiro answered when Kirishima apparently didn't know. It's always a one-on-one competition, but I think it was a 𝗵𝗲𝗃 thing last year. Oh man, that would have been so fun, Ashido pouted, crossing her arms. Just as Midnight prepared to draw lots to determine the first matches of the tournament, Ojiro stepped up with his hand raised. I'd like to withdraw from the tournament, Ojiro said hesitantly, shocking everyone around him. I can't remember a thing from the cavalry battle until close to the end, probably because of that guy's quirk. Ojiro trailed off with a troubled look on his face, and Kyoka couldn't help but wonder who he was talking about. Midoriya seemed to have an idea, though, as he looked over his shoulder at a guy with purple hair. I know it might seem pretty stupid to throw away a chance like this, Ojiro continued, clenching a fist in front of his chest, but everyone else gave it their all. I can't keep going forward with you all if I don't know for sure that I did the same. I'd like to withdraw for the same reason, spoke up a stout boy from Class B. I think it would go against the spirit of the sports festival to keep going if I didn't really do anything to earn it, regardless of ability. That's so manly, Kirishima praised, wiping the tears away from his eyes. On the stage, Midnight eyed the two boys with a critical eye, debating her answer. After a moment to let things sit, she opened her mouth to answer. I'll accept your withdrawal, Midnight said, shifting her stance slightly. Normally, such a thing wouldn't be allowed, but this is an irregular situation. Just this once, I'll allow you to withdraw. Ojiro slouched over, relieved at the conclusion that had been reached. Midnight moved on after that, looking to the fifth-place team to decide who should move up. But they passed the torch over to the next team down the list, Team 𝗧𝗵𝗧𝗏, claiming that it would just make more sense. As a result, 𝗧𝗵𝗧𝗏 and 𝗧𝗑𝗍𝗍 moved up to take the two spots that had opened up. The first round of matches were decided after that. Match number 1, Aoyama Yuuga vs 𝗧𝗵𝗧𝗏. Match number 2, Bakugo Katsuki vs Ida Tenya. Match number 3, Uraraka Ochako vs Asada Shino. Match number 4, Shizaki Ibara vs Yuuki Asuna. Match number 5, Kirishima Ijiru vs Ashido Mina. Match number 6, Shinso Hitoshi vs Shiro Hanta. Match number 7, Midoriya Izuku vs Kaminari Denki. Match number 8, Todoroki Shoto vs Yaoyorozu Momo. Kyoka looked over the board, but didn't know how to feel about most of them. She couldn't really claim to know any of her classmates well enough to decide how any of the matches should go. The only one that really caught her eye was match number 7, Midoriya Izuku vs Kaminari Denki. She was looking forward to that one. She was almost certain that Midoriya would win, but it would be interesting to see how their electrical quirks would mix. Kyoka decided to opt out of the recreational games. They didn't seem like a good way to present her abilities, so she decided it wasn't worth her time. As she made her way to the audience area set aside for Class 1A, she passed by Midoriya, who was idly chatting with Asuna. Midoriya offered a quick grin and a wave as Kyoka passed by, which she returned. Dropping into a seat to watch the festivities in the arena below, Kyoka's thoughts began wandering over the day's events and the things that had happened since the school year had begun. She'd made some interesting friends and been through some tough challenges. More than anything else, Kyoka thought of Midoriya Izuku. They'd become unexpectedly close in the short time she'd known him, and he was easily the best friend she'd ever had. As long as I'm alive, I won't let any of my party members die. Not ever. As much as she'd been hurt by his decision to fight alone, Kyoka couldn't deny the safety she'd felt, even when surrounded by villains. That feeling had only redoubled with the look of determination that came after. When Kyoka had extracted an unspoken promise to not die, Kyoka hadn't really considered the implications of what she was feeling until today, seeing the green-haired boy sleep so peacefully with his head in her lap. He'd apologized after, of course, but didn't seem to regret it one bit. And now Kyoka could only wonder why she couldn't regret it either. Hey guys, are you ready? Before we knew it, it was time to begin the final round. Watching the recreational games had been interesting, of course, but everyone seemed to be itching for the main course to finally arrive. This would easily be the most popular event of the day. On my left, Ida and Uraraka shared an excited glance, the both of them clearly excited for what was to come. I know you've all been dying to see it, or even take part. After everything that's happened, we've finally arrived. It's time for the tournament. Give it all you've got, plus ultra. Near everyone in the audience responded with a plus ultra of their own, and I couldn't help but be pumped. President Mike continued to hype up the audience for another minute, before calling the first competitors to the arena. First up, he seriously can't stop sparkling. It's Aoyama Yuuga from Class 1A. Bonjour, 𝗕𝗓𝗄𝗃 called, posing dramatically as his voice crackled over the intercom. It was an odd decision to outfit all the competitors of the tournament with hearty little microphones. I could only imagine it was for dramatic effect, letting the audience soak in whatever speeches or banter that might happen in the coming battles. Versus a man of honor with manly and passionate steel. It's 𝗕𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬 from Class 1B. All right, 𝗕𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬 yelled, slamming his fists together as he covered his whole body with steel. Let's have a good fight. As much as I would have loved to root for 𝗕𝗓𝗄 as my classmate, I had my doubts as to how well he'd hold up in a match like this. Now then, the first match of the first round. Start. 𝗕𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬 made the first move, sprinting full on at 𝗕𝗓𝗄. He was stopped in his tracks, however, as the sparkly blonde boy fired his laser full force at the steel boy, forcing him to cross his arms in guard. Who do you think will win? Jirō asked, nudging me from my right side as 𝗕𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬 started sliding backwards from the force of the laser. 𝗕𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬, probably, I answered, prompting a curious look from the punk girl. 𝗕𝗓𝗄 let his laser stop, allowing the steel boy to advance once again. 𝗕𝗓𝗄's biggest weakness is that his laser causes him really severe cramps. He'll have to find a way to either end it quickly, or end it without his quirk at all. 𝗕𝗓𝗄 dodged a few of 𝗕𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬's swipes, bouncing around the steel boy flamboyantly in an attempt to lead him towards the edge. Quit bouncing around, will ya? 𝗕𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬 yelled, growing visibly and audibly frustrated at 𝗕𝗓𝗄's constant evasion tactics. Once it became clear that the steel boy wouldn't take his bait, 𝗕𝗓𝗄 tried one last desperate laser blast. Unfortunately, 𝗕𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬 was ready for him this time, and even though he was pushed back, he held on. Agonizing seconds passed by, and despite the pain he must have been feeling, 𝗕𝗓𝗄 kept firing. It was all for naught, though, as 𝗕𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬 began marching forward, pushing closer and closer to 𝗕𝗓𝗄 through the beam. At the last second, 𝗕𝗓𝗄 let his laser drop, whether it was the pain or the resignation that he'd lost. He made no effort to stop 𝗕𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬 from throwing him out of bounds. 𝗕𝗓𝗄-kun is out of bounds, Midnight called, cracking her whip. 𝗕𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬-kun will advance to the next round. Rip, 𝗕𝗓𝗄, you tried, I muttered, watching as the sparkling blonde boy was carted off by medical bots. I think he'll be feeling that for a while. Uraraka chuckled nervously, prompting nods of agreement from Ada and Jirō, the former of which stood to depart. Well then, I believe I'm next, Ada said, adjusting his glasses nervously. I raised my fist in a quick salute, silently wishing him luck for his fight. He was going to need it. After a couple minutes interlude, President Mike came over the intercom to announce the next bout. It's time for the second match of the tournament. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause that rang out throughout the entire stadium. With a quick glance into the arena, I could see both competitors hovering near the ends of their respective tunnels, waiting to be summoned by the ever-boisterous President Mike. First up, a girl with an explosive quirk and a temper to match. It's 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗁 Katsuki from Class 1A. 𝗵𝗃𝗄 stalked out of her tunnel, strutting right up the stairs confidently, almost imperceptibly. Her head turned towards our seating area and our eyes met. Her face remained blank, oddly, before the moment passed and she focused her attention on her opponent. Versus a speedster from a family of heroic speedsters. It's Ida Tenya, also from Class 1A. Ada marched into the arena robotically. Each step measured carefully as he rose the stairs to face off against 𝗵𝗃𝗄. He took a moment to adjust his glasses, took a deep breath, and settled into a combat-ready stance. This one will be a bit more tricky, I think, I commented. My eyes narrowed as I contemplated each of the competitors. Ada-kun is very fast and precise, so if he stays on his toes, he might be able to avoid a lot of 𝗵𝗃𝗄's explosions. 𝗵𝗃𝗄 is very tenacious, though. The more she sweats, the more explosions she'll be able to let off in a short period of time, so a battle of attrition is almost a guaranteed win for her. Second match, start. Ada wasted no time in approaching 𝗵𝗃𝗄, speeding towards her with a high-powered kick. 𝗵𝗃𝗄 saw it coming and ducked under, letting off a medium explosion that knocked Ada towards the edge, though the bespectacled boy was able to recover and land well before he sailed out of bounds. Yo, Midoriya, Kirishima called, leaning on the back of the empty seat that Ada had been sitting in before. I hummed and tilted my head slightly in his direction to show I was listening, but didn't take my eyes off the fight below. After what appeared to be a moment of deliberation, Ada launched another series of attacks, with 𝗵𝗃𝗄 using her explosions to evade and counter-attack whenever possible. Are you and 𝗵𝗃𝗄 like a thing? Wait, what? A thing? I asked weakly, looking at Kirishima like he'd grown a second head, which he returned with a wry grin. You guys have known each other for a long time, right? He asked, sitting back in his seat. It's pretty obvious that she has a major soft spot for you. And with what happened at the USJ, it's kinda hard not to wonder. I stayed silent for a moment, contemplating my response. Uraraka looked like she couldn't decide whether to pay attention to the fight in the arena, or the conversation happening around her. On my right, 𝗧𝗏 kept her attention on the fight below with a sullen expression. I raked my hand through my hair with a sigh as I began to speak. I've known Bakugo since we were in diapers, I began, focusing my attention on the fight below. Ida was putting up a valiant fight, but he was clearly beginning to tire in the face of Bakugo's ever-expanding explosion. Our parents all went to school together. When we were toddlers, I could have easily said that Bakugo was my best friend, but things changed when our quirks came in. Asuna-chan said something about Bakugo treating you badly before, I think, Uraraka commented, glancing at me with a concerned expression. Was it because of your quirks? That's right, I confirmed with a nod. It's important to understand that a lot of Bakugo's terrible behavior, before and now, are the result of shitty teachers enabling shitty habits. Because they weren't good teachers, they, I guess, forced Bakugo to become a shitty person. What did they do? Those teachers, 𝗓𝗏 asked, shifting in her seat to face me more easily. They constantly praised her for her powerful quirk, and nothing else, so she grew up believing quirks are everything, and having a good or bad quirk would decide your lot in life. When my quirk came in, I could barely power a light bulb. Obviously, I can do a lot more than that now, but that didn't stop Bakugo from deciding that I couldn't be a hero, and doing all she could to prevent me from trying. A massive explosion drew our attention back to the arena, just in time to see Ida sailing out of bounds, with Bakugo grinning fiercely all the while. Down you go, 4 eyes, Bakugo cheered, pumping her fist in victory. Ida-kun is out of bounds, Midnight called, posing dramatically and cracking her whip once more. Bakugo-san moves to the next round. As the audience erupted in cheers and applause once more, Bakugo struck another victory pose before turning on her heel and exiting the arena. That isn't very manly. But it doesn't sound like the Bakubro I've seen, Kirishima commented with a raised eyebrow. That's because a lot has happened, and Bakugo has started growing up, I explained, scratching the back of my head awkwardly. Trust me, the Bakugo that you know is nothing like the one I grew up with. Kirishima grunted, looking thoughtful for a moment. Well, if you aren't a thing now, you should be. 𝗧𝗏 immediately spluttered, looking vaguely offended by the thought. Before I could really think about why, Uraraka stood and walked away, chortling to herself as she left to prepare for her match. Ida reappeared at the same time, looking vaguely disappointed with himself, even as he returned a high five to Uraraka as they passed by each other. I kinda thought you'd be interested in her, Kirishima, 𝗧𝗏 commented, having composed herself, but still blushing very slightly. You certainly seem pretty chummy with her, so far. Nah, Kirishima waved his hand, dismissing the thought as he side-eyed a certain girl a few seats down from him. It wouldn't be so bad, I think, but I've got eyes for someone else already. I followed his gaze to Ashido Mina, who was distracted by Bakugo's reappearance, offering the ashen blonde girl praise. As usual, Bakugo just ignored it outright, silently dropping into a seat between the pink girl and Ieyasu. I apologize, but what are we discussing? Ida asked, looking confused as he returned to his seat. Midoriya's love life, Kirishima said with a wry grin, prompting another round of spluttering from 𝗧𝗏 and further confusion from Ida. Please don't say it like that, I sighed, burying my face in my hands with a groan. Let's kick off the third match. Uraraka Ochako let out a deep breath as the roar of the crowd reached her ears. The closer she got to the start of her match, the more nervous she became. She was, of course, proud that she'd been able to make it to the final challenge of the sports festival. The more Ochako compared herself to the other people in the tournament, though, the more she began to doubt her ability to make it past her first match. First up, she only looks like a non-threat, and she'll wipe the floor with you if you aren't careful. It's Uraraka Ochako, from Class 1A. Ochako took her cue and stepped out of the tunnel, shivering somewhat at the spotlight that present Mike had shone on her. She tried to control her breathing as she ascended the steps into the arena, suppressing her nerves as best as possible. Versus the surprising star that defended the grand prize in the cavalry battle. It's Asada Shino, from Gen Ed's Class 1 degrees Celsius. Ochako knew very little about her opponent. Asada Shino, or Sinan, was a close friend of Midoriya and Asuna and part of their VR gaming group. That alone had Ochako a little worried about the fight to come, combined with the fact that she still didn't really know what Sinan's quirk even was, compared to her own quirk being blatantly advertised in the previous rounds. Ochako was sure she was fighting with a massive disadvantage. Ochako watched as Sinan stepped into the ring, and the girls stared each other down as the crowd went wild. No hard feelings, okay, Ochako called with a quick grin. Sinan grinned back with a thumbs up, and the girls schooled their faces back into combat mode. Start. Ochako and Sinan rushed each other, meeting in the middle to exchange a flurry of punches, each of them dodging and blocking wherever they could. The first exchange told Ochako that Sinan was relatively equal to her in terms of hand-to-hand combat, though it did little to boost her confidence in the wake of the bespectacled girl's greater experience. All I need to do is make her float, and I'll win. That thought repeated in Ochako's mind like a mantra, and she pushed herself to hasten the rate of her attacks. The faster she attacked, though, the more 𝗔𝗵𝗲 seemed to be able to keep up. Frustration bubbled up in her gut, causing her punches to grow more erratic as she tried to search for an opening in her opponent's defense. When that frustration reached a peak, 𝗧𝗪𝗀 threw caution to the wind and tried for an attack that would make 𝗔𝗵𝗲 weightless. Just as the blow was about to land, 𝗔𝗵𝗲 twisted away with unnatural speed, ducking under 𝗧𝗪𝗀's arm and kicking her leg out. 𝗧𝗪𝗀's sense of balance slipped away and she fell on her side. But she immediately responded by twirling her own legs in 𝗔𝗵𝗲's direction, trying to disrupt her opponent's balance. Just as before, 𝗔𝗵𝗲 was able to evade the attack with unnatural speed. The fighting lulled for a moment as 𝗧𝗪𝗀 pushed herself back to her feet, and the normally bubbly girl could feel her frustrations reaching an all-time high. Just the first match. Please, just let me win the first match. As 𝗔𝗵𝗲 rushed in, 𝗧𝗪𝗀 decided to take a different approach. Instead of attacking, she played mostly defense, blocking and evading as she tried to get a read on her opponent's patterns. The pair of them danced around each other, 𝗧𝗪𝗀 trying to lead them towards the edge of the arena to try for a win by ring out. The closer they got to the edge, the more 𝗧𝗪𝗀's anxiety grew. Every time she blinked, an old memory came back in greater detail of a promise she'd made to her parents as a little girl. Now at the very edge, 𝗧𝗪𝗀 dodged under a punch from 𝗔𝗵𝗲, reaching up and gripping her opponent's arm with both hands and taking away her gravity with a triumphant grin. I win. 𝗧𝗪𝗀's heart swelled with relief as she turned and hurled as hard as she could, throwing 𝗔𝗵𝗲 out of bounds with a classic judo toss. Triple. That relief turned to horror as 𝗔𝗵𝗲 recovered midair, reaching down to latch onto 𝗧𝗪𝗀's still outstretched arm. Without wasting any time, the bespectacled girl twisted down, flipping herself over 𝗧𝗪𝗀's head and planting both feet in her back to kick her out of bounds. 𝗧𝗪𝗀-san is out of bounds. 𝗧𝗪𝗀 pushed herself up to a sitting position, spitting out grass as she turned to stare at 𝗔𝗵𝗲 with a mixture of despair and incredulity. I couldn't even react. The crowd cheered for 𝗔𝗵𝗲 as she floated a few feet above the arena, grinning victoriously and wobbling her arms and legs as she tried to maintain an upright position. 𝗧𝗪𝗀 would have laughed at how goofy she looked if she wasn't frustrated with the outcome. With a sigh, 𝗧𝗪𝗀 wiped the sweat from her brow and pressed her fingertips together to let 𝗔𝗵𝗲 down. Even if I knew this could happen, it's still so frustrating. 𝗧𝗪𝗀 stood and left, disappearing into the tunnel without sparing 𝗔𝗵𝗲 a second glance. Once she was certain she was out of view around a corner, 𝗧𝗪𝗀 screwed her eyes shut and let the tears begin to fall. That was really close, 𝗧𝗪𝗀 commented, casting a concerned glance at 𝗧𝗪𝗀 as she disappeared into the tunnel. 𝗧𝗪𝗀 didn't look too good just now, though. She's probably upset with the way it ended, Midoriya said with a concerned frown of his own. She got so close to winning, only to have it snatched away at the last second. I know I'd be pissed. I imagine it must be frustrating. Ida hummed, performing one of his trademark chopping motions. Silence reigned as the three of them slumped over, worried thoughts running through each of their heads. I'm gonna go check on her, 𝗧𝗪𝗀 said after a moment of silence, and stood to leave. She ignored the questioning gazes of her friends as she stepped into the hallway, more preoccupied with the fact that she didn't actually know where to look. As 𝗧𝗪𝗀 wandered down the hall towards one of the prep rooms, she saw one of her classmates ahead of her, staring down an adjacent hall. You're in my way, 𝗳𝗪𝗀𝗁 snapped, causing 𝗧𝗪𝗀 to jump slightly. Before she could react, a voice from the other hallway made her realize that her classmate wasn't talking to her, and probably didn't even realize she was there. You're acting disgracefully, 𝗬𝗪𝗀, came the voice of the number 2 hero, 𝗕𝗫𝗫. With wide eyes, 𝗧𝗪𝗀 retreated around a nearby corner, and was about to leave entirely when a thought came into her mind. There's a whole mess of crazy going on behind his scenes. 𝗧𝗪𝗀 halted in her tracks, torn between wanting to know what was going on, and the feeling that she probably shouldn't get involved. You'd have had an overwhelming victory in the first and second events if you'd only used your left side, 𝗕𝗫𝗫 continued. Instead, your childish rebellion has caused you to hand those victories to that whelp. Whelp. Midoriya is not a whelp. 𝗧𝗪𝗀 bit back a retort as she clenched her fists. As angry as she was, she doubted she could get away with sassing the number 2 hero without consequence. You have a duty to surpass All Might, 𝗬𝗪𝗀. Just shut up, already, 𝗳𝗪𝗀𝗁 snapped, sounding angrier than 𝗧𝗪𝗀 had ever heard him before. You sound like a broken record, talking about that and nothing else. Both voices fell silent, with nothing but 𝗳𝗪𝗀𝗁𝗁's footsteps to fill the quiet of the hall. 𝗧𝗪𝗀 turned and left without waiting to listen for more, her mind reeling with the little that she'd already overheard. Jirochan. 𝗧𝗪𝗀 jumped out of her skin as a voice called out to her, and she turned sharply to face 𝗧𝗪𝗀𝗀, who was standing in the open doorway of the prep room. Are you okay? 𝗧𝗪𝗀𝗀 asked, shifting from one foot to the other. I tried calling out to you just now, but you seemed kinda lost in thought. I'm fine, 𝗧𝗪𝗀𝗀 said a little too quickly, doing little to convince her normally bubbly friend. The punk girl motioned for them to enter the prep room, and they were seated at one of the tables before long. I came to check on you, actually. But I'm okay, 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗧 mumbled, seemingly unaware of her own puffy red eyes and tear tracks. 𝗧𝗏𝗁 shot her a look, and 𝗧𝗧𝗏 shrunk down somewhat into her seat. Okay, maybe I'm not. The two girls sat in silence for a moment as 𝗧𝗧𝗏 contemplated her next words. 𝗧𝗏𝗁 said nothing, waiting patiently for her friend to work through what she was feeling. I guess it's just really frustrating, you know. 𝗧𝗧𝗏 started, fidgeting in her seat as 𝗧𝗏𝗁 nodded along. I got so close. I had her, and then she got you. 𝗧𝗏𝗁 finished for her, causing her friend to slouch over in despair. Yeah, 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗁 mumbled, clenching her hands into fists as they rested on the table. I know it's just a competition, and I should be grateful that I even made it to the tournament in the first place, but I feel like I really didn't get a good chance to show off what I can do. You only lost because your opponent had a good counter, 𝗧𝗏𝗁 pointed out. Everyone saw how close it was. Besides, even if you lost the first match of the tournament, it's impressive that you even got that far. I know, 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗁 groaned, leaning back in her chair as fresh tears began to well up in her eyes. I just remember how I said that I want to be a hero for money. It's because my family is really poor. My parents own a construction company, but it's small and it doesn't get contracts as easily as other companies do. So you want to get your license to help them out, 𝗧𝗏𝗁 surmised, leaning over and rubbing 𝗧𝗧𝗏's back gently. Even if they don't let you do stuff for them directly, you can still make lots of money to support them financially, right? Exactly, 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗁 confirmed, taking a deep breath and wiping at her eyes. I guess that's why I'm so frustrated. I want to hurry up and help them, you know. But I can't do that as well if I can't show off what I'm really capable. Why hurry? There's still 2 more years to go, and by then you'll be even better than you are now. As it is, you're already one of the best hand-to-hand fighters in our class. Nowhere to go but up, right? So take your time with it. If you rush, you run the risk of messing something up. 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗁 said nothing in response, but scooted her chair over and leaned her head on 𝗧𝗏𝗁's shoulder, and the punk girl put her arm around her friend comfortingly. Thanks, Jirō-chan, 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗁 said, pulling away after a few moments. What for? 𝗧𝗏𝗁 asked, leaning against the table with a little smile. For listening, 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗁 answered, grinning broadly at her punk-themed friend. It made me feel better. Really? 𝗧𝗏𝗁 didn't say anything, opting to chuckle instead. She didn't really feel like she did anything, but 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗁 did seem to be better off now. By the way, 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗁 started with a mischievous smile, prompting a raised eyebrow from 𝗧𝗏𝗁. That conversation when I left earlier was pretty interesting. Oh, how so? 𝗧𝗏𝗁 asked, a cold feeling suddenly appearing in her stomach. Well, you didn't seem to agree too much when Kirishima said that Midoriya-kun and Bakugo-sen should get together. Did you? 𝗧𝗏𝗁 asked pointedly, focusing her eyes on the table instead of her friend. I dunno, I think they'd be kinda cute together, 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗁 said, her grin growing a little wider as 𝗧𝗏𝗁 sighed with exasperation. Then again, I think you look cute together too, 𝗧𝗏𝗁 spluttered then, feeling her face heat up as she stared at 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗁 with bewilderment. And Midoriya and I. No way, that's not, 𝗧𝗏𝗁 protested, cutting herself off when her brain failed to form a coherent defense. 𝗧𝗧𝗁 had the audacity to start laughing then. And even though 𝗧𝗏𝗁 knew she was just teasing, she couldn't help but glower at the girl. I should have just left you alone. 𝗧𝗧𝗁 only laughed harder, and 𝗧𝗏𝗁 stared back at her with a withering look. I nearly jumped from my seat when Gyro dropped into hers beside me, and I shot her a questioning look as 𝗧𝗧𝗁 passed by to return to her own seat next to it. Everything all right? I asked, eyeing the blush dusting Gyro's cheeks. You made a big mistake, introducing 𝗧𝗧𝗁 to Asuna, Gyro declared, refusing to look my way. I raised an eyebrow and looked at 𝗧𝗧𝗁, who only snickered to herself. Now it's time for the 4th match of the tournament. I just sighed and let it drop. 𝗧𝗧𝗁 seemed better now than when she'd left the arena, at any rate. Out of all the matches in the first round, this is the one I was looking forward to the most. First up, she's a reminder that pretty things often have thorns. It's Shiozaki Ibara, from Class 1B. Out of the tunnel came a girl with long green hair. I hadn't seen her at all during the obstacle course, and only caught a brief glimpse during the cavalry battle, so I didn't really know what to expect. The only thing I knew about her quirk was that it affected her hair, turning the strands into vines. Versus, quicker than a flash of lightning, it's Yuuki Asuna, also from 1B. I snickered to myself over Present Mike's commentary, drawing confused looks from my friends. Is something amusing, Midoriya-kun? Ida questioned, raising his eyebrow at me. Kinda, yeah, I confirmed, watching as Asuna ascended the steps into the arena. I'm not the only one who had a reputation in 𝗬𝗏. Asuna's main combat style is with a rapier, a thin weapon that focuses on speed rather than strength. She became so skilled with it that people started calling her Lightning Flash Asuna. Ida hummed an acknowledgement, though he and the others didn't seem to be as amused as I was. Asuna remained stock still as her opponent turned to face away from her. 𝗧𝗑𝗁 clasped her hands together in front of her chest, appearing to pray as her hair extended down and dug into the concrete, the vines ripping the ground apart as they shot towards Asuna. In an instant, the vines were more than halfway to their target. And that's the moment that Asuna chose to move. She shot towards her opponent, leaping to the side so as to let the vines shoot past her. Without wasting any time or movement, Asuna continued sprinting towards 𝗧𝗑𝗁. With a quick look over her shoulder, the green-haired girl panicked as she noticed how close Asuna had gotten, and hastily constructed a wall of vines in between them. It was all for naught, as Asuna effortlessly danced around the vines and latched onto her classmate. With a triumphant grin and a quick muttered apology, Asuna warped them to the edge of the arena and gently tossed 𝗧𝗑𝗁 out of bounds. 𝗧𝗑𝗁 is out of bounds. 𝗬𝗧𝗁 advances to the next round. Looks like it was decided in an instant, folks. Asuna immediately stepped out of the arena and offered her hand to 𝗧𝗑𝗁, who took it gratefully and was helped to her feet. Uraraka, Kirishima, and the rest of the stadium erupted in cheers and applause for Asuna's victory, and her upstanding behavior afterwards. Couldn't she have ended it even faster if she'd warped at the start? Jiraiya asked confusedly. Probably, but I imagine she'd be saving her energy for later matches, I answered, crossing my arms and tapping my fingers lightly. Asuna's quirk isn't quite a teleport. It only looks like that. Oh yeah, Uraraka exclaimed, looking over at us excitedly. In the cavalry battle, it felt a lot like a dash more than anything else. Right, you go from point A to B in an instant, but there's still motion. Ah, yes, I remember the flash of light from the obstacle course, Ida commented, rubbing his chin lightly once again. Does it require a great deal of stamina to perform such motions? Sort of, I said with a little sigh as I unfolded my arms. Asuna's range is about 10 meters. If you imagine how much energy it takes the average person to run that distance with their legs, it would take a good deal more energy to run the distance if their entire body was needed, right? That's about how Asuna's quirk works. She can go really fast, but she'll tire a lot faster than the average person. So if she expects to make it to later matches, she has to limit the number of times she can use her quirk, Jiraiya summarized, and I nodded with a grunt of acknowledgement. Thinking about the next couple rounds of matches, Asuna would have to face Sinon next, and Bakugo after if she won. She was going to have her hands full, for sure. Ijuru was torn. His match was next, and he was definitely nervous. He couldn't help but wring his hands as he waited to be called into the arena. First up, a man of honor, with manly and passionate hardening. Even our introductions are the same. Ijuru muttered to himself with a sigh, his eye twitching as he thought of his counterpart in the other heroics class. Hopefully I get to fight him. Then again, his next fight is against 𝗵𝗃𝗏, so probably not. It's Kirishima Ijuru, from Class 1A. Ijuru sighed again and put it out of his mind, putting on a strong face as he stepped out of his tunnel. It wasn't long before his thoughts returned to his opponent, as they always seemed to, and he resisted the urge to shake his head roughly. Versus, she's the life of any party. It's Ishido Mina, also from Class 1A. Ishido Mina, Ijuru's classmate since middle school, love interest, and source of inspiration to become a hero. She was the last person that Ijuru wanted to fight right now, and that's why he was so torn. As much as he wanted to avoid fighting the person that had ultimately put him on this path, more so even than his hero idol Crimson Riot, Ijuru knew deep down that it would be disrespectful to give anything less than his best. Let's have a good fight, Kiri, Ishido called in a sing-song voice as she stepped into the arena, and Ijuru grinned back in response. For a moment, Ijuru was reminded of that day in the street 2 years ago. More importantly, he was reminded of the paralyzing fear that had bound him to inaction that day. But he wasn't bound by that fear now. He'd come a long way to escape that cowardice. As the match began, Ijuru hardened his body as well as his heart, and charged, only to fall flat on his face as he tried to pass over a puddle of weak acid that Ishido had laid down. Well, that's embarrassing. Part of him wanted to be upset about it, but Ishido was giggling up a storm, so Ijuru supposed it wasn't too horrible. He pushed himself up with a chuckle and resumed his charge. Ijuru tried for a punch, only Ishido to dance away, laying down acid all the while. For the next few minutes, it went on like that. It was obvious to him that Ishido was whittling away at his mobility while keeping out of his reach, a good counter for his straightforward assault. Do you give up? Ishido teased, grinning mischievously at Ijuru as he pushed himself up from the ground yet again. Not a chance. Ijuru returned with his own grin. The entire arena was soaked in the weakest acid that Ishido could produce. Having fallen face first in that acid multiple times left it stinging pretty bad. But he was more annoyed that he wasn't really able to move anymore. Compared to the ever-agile Ishido, things weren't looking too great for him. Ijuru's only saving grace was that he'd been able to recover before his pink opponent could try to grapple him out of bounds. In addition, Ishido's focus on evasion was starting to wear her stamina down. She was clearly tiring. 𝗓𝗧𝗠's simple attacks and recovery times meant he was gaining stamina back at a higher rate than his opponent, given that Ishido was a long-time break dancer. And 𝗓𝗧𝗠 had only been seriously working out for a couple years now. He felt he had a right to be proud of how far his endurance had come. Only one thing left to try. With a sigh, 𝗓𝗧𝗠 plopped his butt down in the acid and reached for his shoes. Ishido, Midnight, and the entire stadium watched with confusion as the red-haired boy undid his shoes and pulled off his socks. Gritting his teeth against the sting of the acid, 𝗓𝗧𝗠 hardened his feet as much as he could and slammed each one down as he stood back up. Ishido looked on in shock as her red-haired opponent stomped towards her, digging his toes into the concrete to maintain traction through the slippery terrain. It was a war of attrition at that point, one that Ishido was slowly but surely losing. The few times that she had tried for more potent acid, 𝗓𝗧𝗠 had managed to simply force his way through the pain and continue closing the distance. In the end, the red-haired boy was able to take hold of his longtime classmate and toss her in such a way that she simply slid out of bounds as though she were riding a water slide. Ishido-san is out of bounds. Kirishima-kun advances to the next round. Midnight declared his victory with a crack of her whip, and Ishido stared back at him with fatigue and wide-eyed wonder. That was a great fight, 𝗓𝗧𝗠 declared, wandering over and offering his hand to the pink girl with a broad grin. After a moment of staring, Ishido took the proffered hand and let herself be pulled to her feet. Yeah, it was, Ishido exclaimed, grinning toothily at her friend with a light blush. Ah, young love, Midnight sighed, posing dramatically as she smiled at the pair of them mischievously, causing them both to splutter and refuse to look each other in the eye. Kyoka felt her face heat up a little at Midnight's comment about young love. Between Midoriya using her lap as a pillow and Uraraka's subsequent teasing, the punk girl was in no mood to be reminded of romance in any capacity. So, who's up next? Kyoka asked in a deliberate attempt to take her mind off things. 𝗧𝗏 is up against that purple-haired guy from before. Shinso, I think, Midoriya answered, rubbing the back of his neck as his eyes unfocused from deep thought. I didn't really see much of him during the other events, so I have no idea what to expect from him. Now it's time for the 6th match of the first round. Only 2 to go after this one. Hopefully this one finishes up quickly. I want to watch Midoriya's match. Kyoka couldn't help but look at the green-haired boy out of the corner of her eye. He appeared to be lost in thought, though he appeared to have resumed his finger tapping from before in what she assumed to be a nervous tic. First up, he didn't do anything to stand out before, but he's here now. It's Shinso Hitoshi, from Genet's class 1 degrees Celsius. Out of the tunnel came the purple-haired boy, walking casually towards the arena and ascending the steps. Kyoka hadn't seen anything he'd done in the cavalry battle, but she'd spotted him sitting on top of 2 other students during the obstacle course. She could only assume he had some kind of influence quirk, but she supposed only time would tell. Versus, he's about as plain looking as it gets. It's 𝗧𝗏 from class 1A. That's really mean, 𝗧𝗏 mumbled, likely forgetting about the microphone he was equipped with as he stepped out of his own tunnel. Looking between them, Kyoka noticed that Shinso was lacking a bit in terms of muscle mass. Hey, Shinso called, smirking somewhat as 𝗧𝗏 stepped into the arena. Let's have a good fight. Oh no, don't do it, 𝗓𝗏 muttered with a mildly panicked expression. Don't fall for it, 𝗧𝗏. Start. Sure thing, 𝗧𝗏 responded, immediately firing tape from both elbows to subdue Shinso. Just as he started to drag the purple-haired boy towards the edge, all motion in the arena halted completely. Shinso audibly sighed in relief, taking a moment to break out of the tape he'd been bound with. What the frick? Now turn around and walk out of bounds, Shinso commanded. Without wasting any time, 𝗧𝗏 turned on his heel and strode directly out of the arena. The entire arena was dead silent as 𝗧𝗏 came back to his senses after, and turned to stare at Shinso with an incredulous expression. As 𝗧𝗏-kun is out of bounds, Shinso-kun moves on to the next round. Shinso just smirked as he turned and walked away, leaving a confused and thoroughly upset 𝗧𝗏 behind. Dang it, I even warned him, 𝗓𝗏 groaned, hiding his face in his hands as the end of his tail twitched in the air anxiously. Warned about what? Midoriya asked somewhat sharply, looking rather unsettled at what he'd just witnessed. I had my suspicions, and this match just proved it, 𝗓𝗏 started, leaning back in his seat and looking at Midoriya with a tired expression. Shinso's quirk activates if you respond to him, and then he takes control of you. So that's what you were talking about, Midoriya murmured. Is that how he got you on his team? 𝗓𝗏's only response was to nod. That's a bit messed up. Gives me chills just thinking about it, Uraraka commented, shuddering somewhat. Midoriya seemed to contemplate it for a moment longer, but said nothing as he stood to leave for his match. Good luck, Kyoka called, knowing he probably wouldn't need it. Regardless, Midoriya stretched a fist out to one side, answering her with a gesture of quiet resolve. He's totally gonna win, Uraraka said after the green-haired boy was out of earshot. Kyoka said nothing in response, just staring at Midoriya's back as he walked away. For an instant, her vision changed, and she could almost see the green-haired boy wearing his black long coat. 𝗓𝗪𝗏, is something the matter? Ada was looking at her with a concerned expression, but 𝗓𝗧𝗏 was only smiling mischievously again. Kyoka only shook her head in response and focused her attention on the empty arena. Ada didn't seem too convinced. However, I think she's got it bad, 𝗓𝗧𝗏 joked, grinning smugly at her punk friend. Ada looked between the two girls confusedly, not understanding what they were talking about. Shut up, no I don't, Kyoka refuted, her face heating up as she started blushing hard. Sure, 𝗓𝗧𝗏 placated, still grinning smugly and looking like she didn't believe her friend at all. What on earth are you two talking about? Ada asked, looking more confused than ever. Who's ready for the 7th match of the tournament? The entire stadium erupted in cheers, and Kyoka latched onto the distraction with a level of desperation she couldn't recall ever feeling before. Thankfully, 𝗓𝗧𝗏 didn't push the matter further, and Ada let himself be distracted as well. Thank God. First up, he's been dominating the leaderboards all day long. It's Midoriya Izuku, from Class 1A. Midoriya emerged from his tunnel, striding confidently across the grass towards the arena platform. The way he held himself gave off a certain pressure, though, and Kyoka wondered not for the first time how he came so close to feeling like a walking weapon. His performance so far has been electrifying. It's Kaminari Denki, also from Class 1A. Kaminari stepped out of his own tunnel looking nowhere near as confident as his opponent. Kyoka could almost see the fear on his face. His hunched shoulders and shaky steps showed clearly that he didn't want anything to do with this fight. Can't really blame him for that. 7th match, start. Midoriya opened with a punch, letting off one of his electrical rockets, and sprinting immediately after. Seeing the attack coming, Kaminari panicked and threw his arms up to block. Kyoka remembered him saying he was immune to electrical-type attacks, but the kinetic force was enough to blast him backwards somewhat. Midoriya had crossed the distance between them before Kaminari was able to recover, and the blonde-haired boy let off a sizable amount of electricity. Not enough to short-circuit his brain, but enough to stop his opponent in his tracks. Unfortunately for him, Midoriya was able to absorb all of the electricity that Kaminari let out. Midoriya-kun can absorb electricity, and Kaminari-kun is immune to it, Ada mused, rubbing his chin once again. It seems as though their quirks cancel each other out, which means it's down to hand-to-hand combat. Kyoka continued for him, prompting a nod from her bespectacled friend. Unless Kaminari panics and shorts out his brain anyway. Even if he doesn't, I don't think he can keep up with Midoriya-kun's experience, 𝗓𝗧𝗏 commented, looking somewhat worried. Midoriya-kun is practically an expert at quirkless fighting by now, even if he doesn't have the swords he's used to. Midoriya and Kaminari traded blows, with the latter being more sloppy and evasive than offensive. With every exchange, Kaminari started taking more and more hits, and eventually he backed up hard enough that he fell over entirely. Midoriya tried for a pin, only for his blonde-haired opponent to roll away in a panic and shoot to his feet, letting off another torrent of electricity. Just as before, however, Midoriya was able to absorb everything that Kaminari had let out. Kaminari was dangerously close to short-circuiting his brain by now, and Kyoka could see the signs start to appear on the blonde-haired boy's face. His normally sharp eyes were starting to round out, and his expression was slowly but surely becoming more derpy as the match continued on. I hate to say it, but he'd be better off just surrendering. The two boys exchanged another round of blows, but Kaminari was slowing down significantly. Just as the fight started to drag on, Midoriya went low and kicked his foot out, depriving his opponent of balance and sending him to the ground. The green-haired boy set his foot down on one of Kaminari's wrists, held the other with one hand, and poised his other hand with electricity towards the blonde boy's face. Kaminari-kun is unable to move. Midoriya-kun advances to the next round. Midoriya released Kaminari, backing up a step and offering the boy a hand up. Instead of taking the proffered hand, Kaminari immediately crawled backwards, bolting to his feet and fleeing from the arena. Midoriya watched him go, his expression a mix of surprise and sadness. What the fuck? Kyoka exclaimed eloquently, having bolted to her feet and planted her hands on the railing in front of her. She was pretty sure she was the only person in the entire stadium to have said something in response to what had just happened. I wasn't aware that Kaminari-kun was so fearful of Midoriya-kun, Ada mumbled, looking thoroughly shocked by what he had just witnessed. But there's nothing to be afraid of, 𝗓𝗧𝗏 said confusedly. Equally shocked, Midoriya-kun can be pretty intense sometimes, but I haven't seen anything scary. It's probably because of what happened at the USJ, Kyoka ceased, her confusion giving way to outrage. Midoriya threw himself at a big group of villains by himself, even though Kaminari, Ieyasu and I were all right there. He let out this pretty gnarly yell, probably to make the villains focus on him and stuff. I guess it spooked Kaminari, but I didn't realize he'd focus on that instead of, Midoriya risking his literal life to save us. We can't always help how we feel about things. A voice spoke up behind 𝗬𝗁, and she turned sharply to face a sullen Midoriya. 𝗬𝗁 hadn't realized she'd ranted long enough for her green-haired friend to reappear in the audience booth. Kaminari isn't back yet. He hasn't appeared yet, Ida confirmed, rising from his seat to approach Midoriya. He likely did not come straight here, as you did, however. Bitch-ass Pikachu better be hiding right now. Bakugo grumbled from the far side of the booth, looking like she'd be ready to explode Kaminari at a moment's notice. Midoriya just sighed and walked over to swat the ashen blonde girl over the head lightly. Boy, what the fuck? What did I just say? Midoriya asked, glaring tiredly at Bakugo, who stared back sullenly. He probably can't help how he feels. I did get pretty vicious at the USJ, after all, so I can't blame him for being afraid. Oh, fuck that, Bakugo exclaimed sharply, standing up and vaulting over the back of her seat and starting towards the exit, only to stop as Midoriya took hold of her arm and held her back. Let go, nerd. I'm gonna give that bitch ass a piece of my mind. Don't. Everyone stopped to look at 𝗬𝗁, who hadn't realized she spoke up until everyone's eyes were on her. Swallowing thickly as everyone stared at her, 𝗬𝗁 raced to try and process her thoughts. Midoriya's right, 𝗬𝗁 said with a sigh, twirling a jack around her finger nervously. If Kaminari really can't help but be afraid, yelling at him isn't gonna change anything, right? He shouldn't have been afraid in the first place, damn it, Bakugo argued, jerking her arm out of Midoriya's grip. There's no reason for it. Then I'll go talk to him and figure out what's going on, 𝗬𝗁 responded, taking a deep breath and starting towards the exit. He's at Recovery Girls right now, came the tired voice of Aizawa-sensei from the end of the hall, causing everyone to jump in surprise. Kaminari didn't feel like talking to me when I checked on him. Maybe you'll get better results. The tired, mummified man shuffled on down the hall away from the booth, everyone staring numbly as he walked away. 𝗬𝗁 shook her head roughly to compose herself and set off the opposite direction, wondering what could be going on in Kaminari's mind. At the same time, she wondered why she'd care so much about what other people thought of her friend, why she'd be so angry that someone would be afraid of Midoriya. 𝗬𝗁 glanced back towards the booth before she rounded a corner, and her eyes briefly met Midoriya. Something flickered in his gaze, and in her mind at the same time, and she began to wonder if 𝗬𝗁 had been onto something with her teasing after all. Stupid, stupid, stupid. That was the only thing that Kaminari Denki had to say about himself as he sat in the stadium's infirmary, knees pulled up to his chest, face pushed into his legs and hidden under his arms. Recovery Girl had given him a once-over, but found no substantial injuries worth using her quirk over. Aizawa-sensei came into the room shortly after, to try and talk Denki through what was going on in his mind. But the blonde boy was too far in the dumps to make heads or tails of it. When it became clear that Denki didn't feel like talking, the adults exchanged a worried look and left the room to give him space. Denki didn't know if he should appreciate that or not. Being left alone with his thoughts made it all too easy for his mind to play back what happened in the arena. It took all he had just to play defense. Indiscriminate shock wasn't a real option because Midoriya could just absorb it, and that was all he had. With or without his swords, Midoriya had spent 2 years fighting without his quirk, had navigated battlefields that Denki couldn't even dream of. A knock on the door pulled Denki from his thoughts. Though he didn't look to see who came in, he heard the door click shut, then the footsteps that approached, and felt the mattress shift as someone sat down beside him. Hey, a decidedly feminine voice came from Denki's right. He looked up to see who it was, but couldn't tell who it was beyond his blurry vision. Shit, I started crying and didn't realize. Shit, Denki said eloquently, wiping the tears from his eyes and looking back over to see 𝗲𝗁 sitting next to him, a worried expression on her face. What's going on, dude? The punk girl asked gently, pulling one knee up on the bed to face Denki a little more easily. The blonde boy moved his gaze back to his knees, unable to look 𝗲𝗁 in the eye. It's nothing. Just stupid, Denki mumbled, lowering his face so that only his eyes peeked up over his arms as he gazed into empty space. It doesn't really seem like nothing, 𝗲𝗁 said, gently yet firmly. Whatever it is, I promise it's not stupid. We can't always help how we feel about things, right? I guess, Denki conceded, his voice muffled from being hidden behind multiple limbs. 𝗲𝗁 waited patiently for the blonde boy to collect his thoughts in silence. After a few moments of silence, he leaned back and pushed his legs out, crossing them as he stared up at the ceiling. When I first met Midoriya, I felt kinda relieved, you know. I had the thought that, maybe, he'd be like me. Like, with the same problems and stuff. With your quirk, you mean? 𝗲𝗁 asked, tapping a finger against her knee rhythmically. Yeah, Denki confirmed with a sigh. Except, he wasn't like me at all. From the battle trial, and the USJ. Ever since school started, I've just felt like he's a better version of me. Better control of his quirk, a badass fighting style, popular and dependable. Denki used his fingers to emphasize each of his points, before sighing wearily and scratching the back of his head awkwardly. I guess I've just been really jealous of him, and I'm kinda ashamed of that. You're not the only one, 𝗧𝗪𝗀 admitted, prompting a surprised look from the blonde boy. Being jealous, I mean, I've had kinda mixed feelings about it. But when it came down to a fight that actually matters, I got sidelined and he ran off to keep fighting. I know he's really skilled and shit, but I just wish I could have done more to help, you know. I know how you feel, 𝗕𝗂𝘁𝗵𝐺 said, leaning his head against the wall again. It's gotten worse since the USJ, though. Ever since he ran into those villains. And that yell. He trailed off, shuddering. I can't stop hearing it. That scream, the look on his face. He looked like a crazy person. I thought, just for a second, is it a good idea for a guy like that to be a hero? 𝗧𝗪𝗀 narrowed her eyes, but said nothing as the blonde boy continued on. I know he's a good guy, though. He's proven over and over that he deserves to be a hero more than anyone else in our class. But there's still that little thought in the back of my mind that won't go away. And I'm more ashamed of that than anything else. 𝗕𝗂𝘁𝗵𝐺 was nearly yelling by the time he finished talking, and let out a series of deep breaths to de-escalate his emotion. 𝗧𝗪𝗀 said nothing in response, and the two sat quietly as they each contemplated their own thoughts. That contemplation was cut short, however, as the room began to shake violently, accompanied by the distant sound of thunderous reverberations. The heck was that? 𝗧𝗪𝗀 asked, shooting to her feet and looking around in a panic. You think it's villains? 𝗕𝗂𝘁𝗵𝐺 asked, quailing somewhat at the thought. Would they really try something like that at the sports festival? I seriously doubt it, 𝗧𝗪𝗀 responded, calming somewhat as she thought it over. Remember what Aizawa-sensei said. Most of the audience is off-duty heroes. Was it a match, then? 𝗕𝗂𝘁𝗵𝐺 swung his legs over the side of the bed and pushed himself to his feet. Now that I think about it, isn't Todoroki supposed to be up next? Maybe that was his ice thing. Probably. 𝗧𝗪𝗀 visibly relaxed at that, letting out a sigh of relief as she started for the door. I guess I'll go check it out. Are you coming? Yeah, 𝗕𝗂𝘁𝗵𝐺 mumbled, but didn't move from his place as he watched 𝗧𝗪𝗀 leave the room. He was grateful for the distraction, certainly, and more so that 𝗧𝗪𝗀 would come check on him like this. As the two made their way back, 𝗕𝗂𝘁𝗵𝐺 was distantly aware that a certain green-haired swordsman no longer plagued his thoughts, but rather a certain punk-themed girl. Considering her obviously growing relationship with Midoriya, 𝗕𝗂𝘁𝗵𝐺 doubted these thoughts were much of an improvement, overall. 𝗧𝗪𝗀's eyes met mine as she disappeared around the corner, and I felt something shift in the back of my mind. Before I could make heads or tails of what I was feeling, Bakugo's shoulder checked me as she made her way back to her seat with a huff, mumbling something vulgar about Kaminari as she went. I just returned to my own seat, dropping down into it with a huff of my own. Are you really okay, though? Uraraka asked, leaning forward to shoot me a concerned frown from Ada's far side. And the bespectacled boy matched it with a frown of his own. It's okay, I responded, sidestepping the concern deftly by not directly answering the question. They weren't convinced. It's nothing I'm not used to. How can you brush off such behavior so easily? Ada questioned, seeming a little put off. I understand your point about not always being able to help how you feel, but you seem to accept it far more easily than one should reasonably expect. Did I ever mention that I was a beta tester for 𝗬𝗨? I asked in a casual tone, prompting confused looks from my friends. The beta testers were the only people that were allowed to pre-order 𝗬𝗨 before it hit shelves. Once the death game started, people got really upset with the testers, claiming that we weren't doing enough to lead the others through. So you've been dealing with such behavior since the start of the death game? Ada realized, hand on chin as usual. Uraraka looked like she wanted to say something, but I continued on before she could get the chance. I took it a step further than that, actually, I commented offhandedly, shifting in my seat somewhat uncomfortably. I was one of the few beta testers that made it to Aincrad's 10th floor, and those that did had a relatively easier time surviving compared to new players or even other, less serious beta testers. Because people saw that general ease early on, they decided to label us as cheaters. I think I saw something online about that, Uraraka said, perking up slightly. Didn't they combine beta tester with cheater to make some kind of insult? Beater? That's right, I confirmed, pointing a finger for emphasis. You've done your homework, I see. I'm kinda surprised, though. Didn't you say you weren't into games? I'm not, but I've been looking up stuff about 𝗬𝗨 since I met you in Asuna, Uraraka admitted, rubbing the back of her head awkwardly. I guess I just wanted to know a bit more, but I always feel bad about asking. I chuckled, ready to offer a placating statement, but Present Mike came over the intercom to announce the next match. Hey guys, ready to finish off the first set of matches? I know I am. Thunderous cheering and applause rang out throughout the stadium, but I couldn't help feeling apprehensive. Todoroki's match was up next. I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation in the tunnel, and the things he'd revealed to me. Some part of me was guilty over the way I'd reacted. I stood by everything I said to Todoroki, but there was a part of me that wished I could have handled it a little more diplomatically. First up, he's had a very frosty showing so far. It's Todoroki Xiaodo, of Class 1A. Todoroki stepped out of his tunnel, and I could immediately tell that he was agitated. Even as he ascended the steps to the arena, he was hunched slightly, and I could barely see his hands balled into fists. Probably had to deal with his asshole dad before the match. Versus all-purpose creation based solely on her own knowledge. It's 𝗬𝗓𝗧𝗵𝗲. Also from Class 1A, 𝗬𝗓𝗧 emerged from her own tunnel, looking somewhat meek and shrunken down compared to her usual self. A part of me was reminded of Kaminari before the start of our own match, but I shook the thoughts off quickly, not wanting to dwell on the blonde boy's turmoil. It's a battle of the recommended elites, folks. Final match of the first round, start. 𝗬𝗓𝗧 made the first move, creating a tower shield and an odd-looking device that she fit over her hand. Todoroki seemed a little out of it, his agitation distracting from 𝗬𝗓𝗧 now sprinting at him at full speed. Tower shield held up. Before long, the distance between them was gone, and the ponytailed girl slammed into her opponent at full speed. The force of the impact sent Todoroki stumbling, but his attention was now fully focused on 𝗬𝗓𝗧. Sorry, 𝗬𝗓𝗧, Todoroki muttered, casting an annoyed glance in the direction of his father, who was loitering in the opposite side of the arena as the student booths. Before the creation quirk user could respond, Todoroki sent out a wave of ice. 𝗬𝗓𝗧 was ready, however. Seeing the ice bolt out towards her, she hugged her tower shield close to her body and leaped in the air, allowing herself to be fully encased in the ice. I cannot imagine that 𝗬𝗓𝗧-kun would allow herself to be defeated so easily. Hida murmured as the audience watched with bated breath. Todoroki sighed and moved to melt the ice, only to stop in his tracks as a medium-sized spout of flame erupted from around where 𝗬𝗓𝗧 was meant to have been encased. Looks like you imagined correctly, then, I quipped as a frosty 𝗬𝗓𝗧 clambered out of the freshly melted hole in the ice, grinning triumphantly down at Todoroki. He just stared right back, further agitated that 𝗬𝗓𝗧 would use fire as a method of breaking out of his ice trap. Apologies, Todoroki-kun, 𝗬𝗓𝗧 called, her voice crackling over the intercom as she brandished her weapon dramatically. I'm afraid I won't be falling for that so easily. Then I'll keep doing it until you run out of fuel, Todoroki bit out, hands clenching at his sides. It'll be quite a while before then, 𝗬𝗓𝗧 commented playfully, lowering her shield to the ground with a thunk. I'm using a mix of gas and kerosene, which is applied directly upon creation. Using her shield as a sled, 𝗬𝗓𝗧 descended the ice as she approached Todoroki once again, dodging waves of ice and melting the ones she couldn't outright avoid. Now in range, the ponytailed girl primed her weapon and shot a gout of flame at Todoroki, who pulled up a quick pillar of ice to block. The intensity of the flame melted the pillar almost instantly, and the quickly evaporating water expanded outwards in a blast that knocked both 𝗬𝗓𝗧 and Todoroki backwards. Todoroki rolled to a stop and was on his feet instantly, where 𝗬𝗓𝗧 steadied herself with her shield to keep from falling over at all, though with the way she was crouched, she vanished from sight entirely. The half-and-half boy took the opportunity to encase his opponent for the second time, then watched warily as he waited for 𝗬𝗓𝗧 to break out again. Only that moment never came. The entire arena was completely silent, and even Midnight looked as though she was considering just ending the fight in Todoroki's favor. And then I caught a brief glimpse of a decidedly black tuft of hair moving around the far side of the glaciated arena. First a flamethrower, and now flanking maneuvers, I summarized, smirking as I put the pieces together. What a pro-gamer move. Seconds later, 𝗬𝗓𝗧 had successfully snuck her around to fully flank Todoroki, leaving him completely unaware of her stealthy tactics. With a quick, smug call to give her opponent a moment to react, 𝗬𝗓𝗧 let off the full force of her flamethrower. Todoroki was completely enveloped in flames, a tactic the ponytailed girl would likely only use because of his resistance to fire. And then the entire arena erupted in an explosion of frost, spreading outward in every direction and reaching even as far as the first row of the seated audience. Every inch of the arena was completely covered in ice. Mist began pooling around the frozen grass areas below the arena. Midnight and 𝗵𝗲𝗄 were physically unaffected, if somewhat panicked. At the edge of the arena was 𝗬𝗓𝗧, encased in ice from the neck down, looking just as panicked as the two heroes on standby. Her weapon was frozen, inside and out, completely disabled. In the center of it all was Todoroki. On his face was a mixture of anger, horror, and sadness. A single tear had streaked down his left cheek. His eyes clouded over, his teeth grit. Don't ever do that again. What the hell just happened? Jirou planted her hands on the railing, then recoiled instantly as the ice bit into her hands. Amidst the pooling mist gathering below, Todoroki could be seen thawing 𝗬𝗓𝗧 out of a sizable pillar of ice. I think there's a reason we don't see much of Todoroki's left side, I commented in a forced casual tone. Whispers and murmurs broke out amongst the crowd, and even our own classmates took to their own forms of gossip. Passing that off as a given, I took a look around. The explosion of ice had gone no further than the railing, and no one besides 𝗬𝗓𝗧 had been frozen, even including the two teachers down in the ring. For such a freak-out response, his precision was almost perfect. Qiru shot me a deadpan look, nursing her hands gently as I surveyed the damage. Todoroki's eyes were clouded over, though I could tell he was trying to grind his teeth into dust. Ieyasu wasn't quite as well put together as the boy in front of her. She'd burst into tears the moment her panic had worn off, apologizing profusely for several seconds before cutting herself off entirely. As soon as Ieyasu was free of the ice, Todoroki turned and left the arena, not bothering to wait around as Midnight almost timidly adjudicated in his favor. Ieyasu, tears almost frozen to her cheeks from the low temperature, silently watched the boy go. Across the arena from us, Endeavor looked thoroughly displeased at the turn of events, a thought that made my stomach turn in anger. President Mike called for an extended break between rounds to get the arena situation sorted back out again. Something to do with his dad, you think? Kyoka asked in a low voice, nudging me in the side gently. I looked back at her with a raised eyebrow as she continued. They were arguing about something right before the match. I heard it when I went to check on Uraraka. My raised eyebrow fell, and I looked back down into the frozen arena with a mildly pained expression. Yeah, I'm thinking so. Aizawa Shouta was pissed. Well, almost. Not quite. If his suspicions were anything to go on, however, he could almost be sure of the hellstorm to come. Tell me you saw that. Mike, Shouta droned as the stadium emptied itself of most audience members. Some remained in small pockets, but the vast majority had stepped out for what Shouta suspected would be around a half hour. I saw it, Mike returned in a low voice, dropping all of his usual charisma, prompting Shouta to grimace. Unfortunate. That means his mind wasn't playing tricks on him, as he'd hoped. Half the kid's quirk is about fire, Shouta started, his arms twitching restlessly in their casts. President Mike leaned back in his chair, arms crossed and fingers tapping as he stared at the ceiling. Why, then, would he have that kind of freak out over a fire-based attack? Mike finished, the rhythmic tapping of his fingers getting progressively faster. Shouta let out a long breath, surveying the swirls of ice built up in the arena. He had to hand it to the kid for having that kind of precision in such a tense moment. Losing any amount of control at all would be something to work on in the future, but Shouta was far more concerned at the implications behind this occurring at all. Call the principal, intoned Shouta, prompting a look of shock from his longtime friend. Wait, why me? Mike exclaimed, only to lose all gusto as the mummified man wiggled his casts around comically. You ought to be more careful, young lady. Ieyasu Momo stared sullenly at the bandages that were being wrapped around her right hand by Recovery Girl, and said nothing. Even with my healing, the skin on your right hand will be damaged for quite a while, if not permanently, Recovery Girl admonished lightly, which Momo didn't know if she should appreciate or not. She'd heard the famous and brutal stories of Recovery Girl's tirades on those she felt were deserving of them, almost exclusively the careless and callous. As much as she dreaded the coming storm, Momo couldn't help but feel as though she deserved it. All right, get out of here. Come back before you go home so I can take another look, and try not to use it too much. Which is why, the moment she was kicked out of the infirmary, she was utterly baffled that the storm never came. With a heavy sigh as the door shut behind her, Momo deliberated on where she should take herself. She wasn't quite feeling up to the well-meaning pestering of her classmates, but she didn't want to hide herself away, either. Setting off down the hall with no particular destination in mind, Momo's thoughts wandered over her match and what little she knew of Todoroki Shouta. Before her thoughts became too deep, however, Momo felt a gentle nudge on her forehead. Momo-chan. Asuna appeared in front of her with an intensely concerned expression. Asuna-chan. Momo mumbled, dazzled somewhat by her oldest friend's sudden appearance. Asuna took Momo by the hand and led her into one of the side rooms, looking somewhat like a smaller version of the waiting room set aside for the student. So, what happened out there? Asuna asked as soon as the two were seated, her voice a mix of authority and concern. It brought a gentle smile to Momo's face, seeing the once timid and awkward Asuna take a more outward leadership approach. If you recall, Momo began, taking a moment to consider her line of thought. We've seen Todoroki-san at many of the parties and get-togethers that we've attended over the years. I don't know if you've ever spoken with him, but I've only ever done so a handful of times. Momo fell silent as Asuna traced a finger over the bandages wrapped around the black-haired girl's hand, a sad expression on her face. Even still, I can't claim to know a thing about him, Momo continued, drawing her friend's attention away from her injury. When I discovered that he'd be a classmate of mine, I'd hoped to change that, if only a bit. I'd also hoped to lure out the reason that he doesn't use his left side as well. He's just arrogant if he thinks he can win while handicapping himself, Asuna snarked, glaring sullenly into empty space. Then again, he was raised by Endeavor, so it makes sense. That was my assumption as well, Momo commented, just as I made the assumption that, being raised by the number 2 hero, he likely did not think well enough of us to use his full strength. It was my assumption that emulating the one person he did respect would be enough for him to draw on his left side. Except, Asuna prompted. I see now that it was a colossal mistake, Momo admitted, clenching her eyes shut as she thought of the final moments of the match. The look on his face as I turned my flames on him can only be described as dread. As soon as eyebrows shot up in surprise, and as the weight of that line of thought set in, both girls came to the same realization at the same time. 𝗕𝗏𝗁𝗍𝗪 𝗧𝗵𝗲 is afraid of fire, not just his own fire, but of his father's as well. 𝗕𝗏𝗁𝗍𝗪 𝗧𝗵𝗲 is afraid of his father. In response to the aborted ending of the first round, it was announced that the second round and rest of the tournament would be delayed to the following day. This was met with disappointed groans amongst most of the audience members, and many among the media began scrambling over each other to try and grab up the top stories before anyone else. Many people across the nation began speculation over this unprecedented delay. And as it was stated as a response to the end of the first round, rumors began to spread about Endeavor's parenting tactics. Before the sun was down, every news channel had broadcasted 𝗕𝗏𝗁𝗍𝗪's shadow's look of despair as he left the arena. It made Katsuki's stomach turn. She'd been rather angry when she heard about the delay, having to wait an extra day to get through the last portion of the sports festival. But with the news investigation into her classmate's home life, she almost felt sick, especially after what she overheard that classmate say to Izuku in the tunnel before the tournament began. To try and take her mind off things, Katsuki did something she thought she'd never, ever do. She put on her 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗵𝗲 for the first time since it came into her possession. It was something she'd gotten as a gift from a friend who just didn't have time for it anymore, along with a copy of some online game called 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗁𝗍𝗪. Katsuki hadn't really ever been a huge gamer, and what little interest she'd had in VR stuff had been killed by the 𝗬 thing happening. But there'd been a little niggling thought in the back of her mind ever since Izuku came back from it, and it had only been growing as time went on. So, finally, after almost 2 years of never touching the VR world, Katsuki finally dove in. "Link start," Katsuki declared, and allowed her mind to be dragged into the cacophony of lights and digital sounds as her vision bled completely white. 𝗬𝗁𝗧𝗏 had never really been one for video games. As one might expect, her main passion growing up had been centered around music, a passion that her parents were only too happy to feed. But then she met Midoriya Izuku, and as the weeks dragged by, she began to wonder at the utility of using VR games to learn to fight. That thought was only spurred further on as she watched two of Midoriya's friends fight in the tournament, one of which had no intention of even being a hero. By the time she stepped out of the arena after hearing about the delay, 𝗬𝗁𝗧𝗏 made up her mind. Stopping at a game store on her way home, she picked up an 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗵𝗲 and a copy of 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗁 online. Knowing it was the one that Midoriya was currently stuck in with his game group, 𝗬𝗁𝗧𝗏 didn't have any intention of telling him this just yet. There was a prideful part of her that wanted to get at least somewhat good before asking Midoriya to party up. After getting an account set up and diving into the game, 𝗬𝗁𝗧𝗏 wondered if maybe she should just bite the bullet and ask for his help instead. She'd been a bit mystified while trying to create a suitable character, not really knowing what roles any of the races were supposed to be, so she'd picked out a Spriggan based solely on aesthetics, only to be eaten by a black hole the moment she spawned in, which took her to a randomized location far away from where any new characters are meant to start. A passing player helpfully informed her that it was a rare, but not unheard of glitch in the system that only happened to Spriggans, and 𝗬𝗁𝗧𝗏 could only curse her own lack of luck. "Of course, they only tell me what happened, but not how to fix it," 𝗬𝗁𝗧𝗏 muttered with a huff as she watched the cat-eared player fly away. Turning her back on the unhelpful stranger, 𝗬𝗁𝗧𝗏 set off across the plains, deciding that the massive tree in the distance looked like a good first destination. After what felt like an hour of walking, the giant tree was no closer. 𝗬𝗁𝗧𝗏 had tried her hand in some combat along the way, getting a feel for the short sword she'd started with, but the enemies in the area were a little bit too tough for her liking. Just when she was ready to throw in the towel, to back out and make another character and hope that the glitch didn't come for her again, a familiar string of profanities reached 𝗬𝗁𝗧𝗏's ear. "Fuck off, you giant clawed fuck." With a little snort, 𝗬𝗁𝗧𝗏 followed the screaming over a hill, the sounds of the fighting growing more intense as she crested to the top. What came into view was an enormous lake that stretched out for miles at least. At the far side of the lake was a patch of tall trees, littered in front of a massive mountain that blocked the way to the giant tree. In the immediate vicinity was a giant lobster, scuttling along the shoreline as it did battle with a spiky blonde-haired woman garbed in red armor and wielding a massive two-handed sword. 𝗬𝗁𝗧𝗏 couldn't immediately define which race this warrior was supposed to be. Based on what she'd seen in the character creator, the blonde hair looked like it belonged to a 𝗬𝗏, but the armor looked more like a salamander's, as did the weapon. A salamander that dyed their hair, maybe? Shaking the thought off as unimportant, 𝗬𝗁𝗧𝗏 watched as the warrior dodged and weaved between the lobster's massive claws, swinging her sword with mighty heaves whenever there was an opportunity. Just when things started to drag on, the giant lobster disappeared in a cloud of polygons before vanishing entirely. "Huh, suck it," cheered the warrior, jamming her sword into the ground and shaking one fist in the air in some kind of victory pose. A moment later, with the large weapon settled onto her back, she turned and noticed Kyoka approach. "The fuck do you want?" "Sorry, I was just watching you fight," Kyoka responded, brushing off the profanity easier than she thought she would. Being around Bakugo on a daily basis had a way of downplaying the intensity of people like Bakugo, Kyoka supposed. "I'm new around here, but some glitch warped me out of the starting area. I don't suppose you'd be willing to show me the ropes." The blonde warrior gave Kyoka a long look, her nose slightly scrunched in either uncertainty or disgust. Just as Kyoka was ready to retract the request, the warrior spoke. "Fine, I guess," she said, sighing deeply as she turned and opened a loot panel where the lobster had previously been. "Word of warning, though. I just started today too, so I'm really not that far ahead yet." "Oh, did you get hit by the same glitch I did?" Kyoka asked confusedly. "Nah, I don't know anything about any glitches. I just came out here because there were too many other people in the starting place." Kyoka just hummed in response, waiting patiently for the other player to finish up so they could move on. "I'm Kyokai, by the way," Kyoka offered. She'd chosen the username simply because it was similar to her own name, and she couldn't be bothered to come up with something unique. "What's your name?" "Lord Explosion Murder." The warrior responded with a feral grin, prompting a deadpan look from Kyoka. "I'm not calling you that." "Why not?" "Because it's stupid. Besides, I don't think the game would let you name yourself that anyway." "Fine, whatever," barked the warrior, glaring ahead with a sullen expression. "My username is Bakuhatsu, so just call me that or whatever." Kyoka just snickered and followed along behind her new companion.